Clara Whitman pressed her ruined hand flat on the counter of Harlan's trading post and watched Edmund Hale, the seventh man in 7 months, slide her courtship letter back across the wood without a single word. Not an apology, not an explanation, just silence and the sound of a door closing on everything she had ever allowed herself to want. She picked up the letter, she walked out, and she told herself for the 7th time that she was finished hoping. She was wrong, because 3 hours later, the most feared man in the Colorado Rockies rode into Red Hollow, a man who had survived 8 winters alone above 9,000 feet, who hadn't spoken to a soul in months, who didn't need anyone and had never pretended otherwise. He walked past every woman in that town. He walked straight to Clara. And the first thing he said wasn't a compliment, wasn't a promise, wasn't pity dressed up as kindness. He said maybe the problem was never you. Maybe they were just looking at the wrong thing. 7 men decided what Clara Whitman was worth. 1 man decided to find out for himself. And what happened next on that mountain changed both of them in ways that Red Hollow and every man who had ever turned her away would spend the rest of their lives wishing they had seen coming. If this story already has its hand around your heart, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. Because it is just getting started. Clara didn't cry that afternoon. She had stopped crying after the 3rd man. By the 7th, something inside her had simply gone quiet, not broken, not defeated, but quiet in the way a fire goes quiet when it runs out of anything left to burn. She picked up her basket from the counter, turned toward the door and walked out of Harlan's trading post the same way she had walked out of every other place in Red Hollow that had ever tried to make her feel small. With her chin level and her eyes forward, she did not look back at Edmund Hale. She did not look at the 2 women near the window who had stopped pretending to examine fabric bolts the moment she walked in. She did not acknowledge the old man who coughed behind his hand to hide the fact that he was laughing. She just walked. The October wind off the mountains hit her the moment she stepped outside, cold enough to sting, and she pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders with her left hand, always her left hand. Always the good one, and told herself what she told herself every time. It doesn't matter. None of these people matter. You are still standing. But standing, she had come to understand, was not the same as living. Red Hollow was not a cruel town by nature, it was simply a practical one. Settlers in the Colorado frontier of the 1870s could not afford sentiment. A wife was a working partner, a laborer, a woman who could haul water, handle livestock, put up preserves for winter, sew men carry, and grind without stopping from before the sun came up until long after it went down. Weakness was not something anyone had patience for. And Clara Whitman, in the eyes of Red Hollow, in the eyes of every man who had ever held a courtship letter up and then set it aside, was the very definition of weakness. Her right hand had been crushed in a mill accident when she was 11 years old. Her father had worked the grain mill on the edge of town, and Clara had been there helping, the way all frontier children helped with everything, when the roller mechanism had seized and caught her hand before anyone could pull her free. She did not remember the exact moment of the injury. She remembered the sound. She remembered her father's face. She remembered a doctor she had never seen before or since, a man passing through on his way west, who had done what he could and told her family to be grateful she kept the hand at all. She was grateful. She had always been grateful. But gratitude did not stop men from looking at her hand and deciding she was not worth the trouble. Edmund Hale was the 7th. She had known, when she agreed to meet with him, that she should not have hoped. He was a decent enough man, ran a small sheep operation 2 miles outside of town, kept to himself, attended church on Sundays, paid his debts. He was not a mean man. That was almost the hardest part. A mean man she could dismiss. Edmund Hale was just a practical one, and when he looked at her hand and thought through what that meant for the kind of life he needed to build, he made a practical decision. He did not love her. He had barely spoken to her more than a dozen times. But she had hoped, and hope, Clara had learned, was the cruelest thing a person could carry in a town like Red Hollow. She was halfway down the main street when she heard Ruth Alderman's voice behind her. Clara. She stopped. She did not particularly want to, but Ruth was her oldest friend in town, and Clara was not the kind of woman who walked away from the people who called her name. She turned. Ruth Alderman was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, practical, and honest in a way that occasionally crossed into unkind. She caught up to Clara in 3 long strides and fell into step beside her, lowering her voice as though what she was about to say required privacy. "You know Edmund wasn't the right match anyway," Ruth said. "I know," Clara said. "He needs a woman who can handle the shearing operation in spring." "That's just reality." I said, "I know, Ruth. I'm only saying it's not personal." Clara stopped walking. She turned and looked at Ruth Alderman with the kind of patience that had been built out of years of practice, the kind that sat on top of something else entirely. "7 men, Ruth," she said, and her voice was even. 7 men, and every single one of them looked at this hand. She held up her right hand, the crooked fingers, the faded scarring along the knuckle and palm, and decided that it told them everything they needed to know about me. "You want to tell me that's not personal, you go right ahead. But don't expect me to agree with you." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I just don't want you to lose hope," she finally said. "I haven't lost hope," Clara said. "I've lost patience. There's a difference." She turned and kept walking. Behind her, she heard Ruth sigh, the specific kind of sigh that meant that girl is going to end up alone, and it's her own fault for having expectations. Clara had been hearing that sigh her whole life, from different mouths, with different faces attached to them. She had stopped letting it sink in. She spent the rest of that afternoon doing what she always did when Red Hollow reminded her of her place in it. She worked. There was always work to be done, and Clara was not a woman who sat still well. She helped Mrs. Loretta Finch, who was 71, and could no longer manage her own water hauling, carry 3 buckets from the well to the old woman's back porch. She mended a tear in the canvas covering on the Hendersons' supply wagon slowly, because of her hand, but thoroughly, because thoroughness was something she could control. She swept the steps of the church without being asked, because the pastor was laid up with a chest cold and the steps were embarrassing. She replaced a loose board on the walkway outside Harlan's trading post, using a technique she had developed over years of adapting tools to the grip of her left hand and the limited strength of her right, working carefully and without complaint until the board was solid and level. Nobody thanked her. Most people walked past without looking at her. That was Red Hollow. She was sitting on the edge of the water trough at the edge of the livery stable resting, just for a moment, because the afternoon had been long and she had not eaten since morning, when she noticed something shift in the energy of the street. She could not have explained it scientifically, but she had lived in frontier towns long enough to know that certain people changed the air when they entered a space. Certain men, specifically men who had been tested by something harder than ordinary life, who that testing in the set of their shoulders and the way they scanned everything around them before they committed to a single step. Gideon Blackwood entered Red Hollow on a gray horse with a pack mule behind him, and the entire street seemed to notice simultaneously. Clara had heard the name. Everyone in the Colorado territories had heard the name, whether they had seen the man or not. Gideon Blackwood was the kind of story that grew in the telling a mountain man who had spent the last 8 years living alone in the Rockies above 8,000 feet, who trapped and hunted and traded and spoke to almost no one, who had once, according to the story people told, dragged a full-grown elk out of a ravine by himself after his pack horse broke a leg and left him with no other option. She did not know how much of any of it was true. She knew he had a reputation the way a storm had a reputation, not through anything he said about himself, but through the evidence he left behind. He looked like the story. He was tall in the saddle, wide through the shoulders, his face weathered by altitude and years, in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with endurance. His beard was dark and close-trimmed, his eyes a shade of gray that caught the afternoon light and held it without giving anything back. He wore no expression she could name. He simply rode into Red Hollow the way a river enters a valley, not hurrying, not hesitating, and entirely indifferent to whether the valley was prepared for it. He stopped outside Harlan's trading post. He dismounted with the economy of movement of a man who had done everything 10,000 times and saw no reason to waste effort on it. He tied the horse. He went inside. Clara watched him go, then looked back down at her hands, both of them, together in her lap, and then looked back up at the door of the trading post, and then thought about absolutely nothing for a moment, which was unusual for her. Inside Harlan's trading post, according to what she pieced together later, Gideon Blackwood spent approximately 20 minutes negotiating the trade value of his season's fur haul, and in those 20 minutes, he managed to hear the end of a conversation that several people in the store had been having at full volume because they saw no reason not to. The conversation was about Clara Whitman. Specifically, it was about the fact that Edmund Hale had just turned her down, which made 7 rejections total, which, in the opinion of Dorothea Price and her sister-in-law Mavis, meant that Clara needed to stop putting herself through the humiliation of courtship and find herself a position in the kitchen of the saloon, since that was the only kind of future that made any practical sense for a woman in her condition. Mavis thought the saloon was being generous. Harlan, himself a decent man, mostly said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Gideon Blackwood listened to all of this and said nothing either. But he stayed by the window, and through that window he could see the water trough at the edge of the livery. He could see Clara sitting there, and then he watched her stand up, watched her notice that a child, no more than 4 or 5 years old, had dropped a small wooden basket in the mud near the middle of the street, and was standing there looking at it with the particular helpless expression of a very small person who has experienced a very large catastrophe. He watched every adult in the street walk past that child. He watched Clara cross to the child, crouch down carefully. She was always careful, always economical with the movements of her right hand, and pick up the basket and its scattered contents from the mud, piece by piece, and hand them back. He watched her say something to the child that made the child stop crying. He watched her stay until the child's mother appeared and collected the little one, and then he watched Clara straighten up and walk back toward the well with her empty water pail, as though none of it had been significant enough to think about. He turned away from the window. He finished his business with Harlan. Then he walked back outside, stood on the steps of the trading post, and looked down the street toward Clara, with the kind of attention that Clara, entirely absorbed in her task, did not notice at all. He noticed it. He noticed the way she worked. He noticed that she did not favor the bad hand by hiding it. She simply adapted around it, constantly and automatically, the way a river adapts around a stone. He noticed that she did not ask for help, did not look around to see whether anyone was watching, did not perform her competence for any audience. She was simply competent, in a town that had spent years deciding she was not. He stepped off the steps and walked toward her. Clara heard the footsteps and looked up. She saw the man from the gray horse up close now, which was different from a distance in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she stood up straighter the way a person stands up when they understand, without being told, that something important is about to happen. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who was not accustomed to talking much, and had therefore stopped spending words on anything he didn't mean. "Sir," she said back. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not rude, it was direct, the way an experienced surveyor looks at land they're considering, taking in actual information rather than making a performance of looking. "You're Clara Whitman," he said. "I am," she said. "And you're Gideon Blackwood." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Something adjacent to it. "News travels," he said. "In a town this size," she said, "so does everything else." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I heard what they said about you." Inside the trading post, she held his gaze. This was something she had practiced, holding people's gaze when they brought up the subject she would have preferred they left alone. Dropping her eyes felt like conceding something she wasn't willing to concede. People say a lot of things, she said. They do, he agreed. Most of it wrong. She waited. I watched you with that child, he said. A child dropped her basket, Clara said. It wasn't anything particular. It was particular enough, he said. Nobody else stopped. She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't offer one. He shifted his weight slightly, which was the closest thing to restlessness she had seen from him yet. I've been in the mountains since last February, he said. I've got a homestead up at 9,000 feet, about a day and a half's ride north of here. I've got more work up there than one person can manage, and a winter coming in hard. He paused. I need someone to come up there and help me run the place. Clara looked at him carefully. You're talking about a wife, she said. I'm talking about a partner, he said. The rest of it would figure itself out, or it wouldn't. This was, in Clara's experience, the most unusual proposal she had ever heard, which was not saying a great deal. Since most of the men who had approached her had not actually proposed, they had simply evaluated and declined. But something about the flatness of his delivery made it feel more serious, not less. He was not making a romantic speech. He was stating a practical reality. And beneath the practicality was something she could not quite name but could feel. He was not looking at her hand. He had not looked at her hand once. Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully, I think you may not be fully informed about my situation. Your right hand was injured when you were a child, he said. Mill accident. You've heard that. Harlan talks, he said. Most people in that store talk. I listen. Then you understand why every man in this town has decided I'm not a suitable. I understand what they decided, he said. I don't especially care what they decided. The afternoon light was changing around them, going long in amber the way October light did in the mountains, and Clara looked at this man, this strange, quiet, utterly direct man who had ridden into Red Hollow on a gray horse and apparently spent 20 minutes listening to people discuss her limitations and come to some conclusion of his own, and tried to make sense of what was happening. You don't know me, she said. No, he said. But I know what I saw. Which was what exactly? He met her eyes. A woman who doesn't need anyone to make it easier, he said. Just someone to stop making it harder. Clara Whitman had been proposed to, if this counted as a proposal, and she was not entirely sure it did 7 times in her life and had been rejected every single time. She had stood in the door of hope so many times it had become a reflex, the standing there, and she had learned to brace for what came after. She was braced now, but Gideon Blackwood was not walking away. He was standing in front of her, in the amber October light of Red Hollow's Main Street, watching her with those gray eyes that gave nothing back, waiting. And something in Clara, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, sat up. I don't know what kind of life is up on that mountain, she said slowly. It's a hard one, he said without hesitation. I won't lie to you about that. The winters are serious. The work is real. It's not comfortable. And you think I can manage it. I think you've been managing hard things your whole life, he said. And doing it without anyone's help. The mountain wouldn't be much different. She looked at him for a long moment, down the street. She could see Dorothea Price had come out of the trading post and was standing on the steps watching them with an expression Clara recognized from long practice as the specific face of a person who cannot believe what they are witnessing. She looked back at Gideon Blackwood. You realize, she said, that if I say yes to this, every person in this town is going to have something to say about it. I'm sure they will, he said. And you don't care. Not even slightly, he said. Do you? And that, Clara realized, was exactly the right question. Because she did care. She had spent years caring what Red Hollow thought, had exhausted herself trying to earn the approval of a town that had decided what she was before she had a chance to show them otherwise, but she cared about it the way you care about a wound that has already healed into a scar. It was there. It didn't hurt the same way anymore. And standing in front of this man, in this particular moment, she found herself caring about it considerably less than she had this morning. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. He said. "Gideon," she said. "I have some questions." "Ask them," he said. "You said the mountain is 9,000 feet and a day and a half's ride. What kind of shelter are we talking about?" "Cabin," he said. "2 rooms, solid construction, root cellar, wood supply enough for the winter if I don't have to start from scratch every morning." "What livestock?" "Pack mule, dozen chickens, 3 goats. Do you have a kitchen range or a cooking fire?" He paused. "Cast iron stove, it draws well."
Any medical supplies?
"Some enough." She nodded slowly. "I'd need to bring my own stores. Some tools I've adapted to my way of working. I'm not going to be slower than you need, but I need to be able to work my way." "I wouldn't ask you to work any other way," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Why me?" she said finally. "Of all the women in Red Hollow, of all the towns between here and Denver, why me?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I need someone who already knows how to be strong, without being told she has to be," he said. "Someone who's been doing it by herself for so long that working alongside another person will feel like a relief instead of a burden." He paused. "This town sees what you can't do. I saw what you can. I'd rather bet on what I saw." The long afternoon light fell across the street of Red Hollow, Colorado, and Clara Whitman stood at the edge of the life she had been living, the years of hoping and being told no, the work nobody thanked her for. The sigh that meant she's going to die alone, and it's her fault, and she looked at the man in front of her, who had not once looked at her hand since they started talking. "All right," she said. Gideon Blackwood did not smile. But something in his expression settled, the way a thing settles when it has found its right place. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "I'll be ready," she said. And she meant it with every part of herself that Red Hollow had spent years trying to convince her was not enough. Down the street, Dorothea Price had been joined by Mavis and by Edmund Hale, who had come out of the feed store in time to see the last part of what had apparently just happened. He stood there in the fading afternoon light, watching Gideon Blackwood tip his hat to Clara Whitman and walk back toward his horse. And watching Clara Whitman stand in the middle of the street with her back straight and her chin level and an expression on her face that Edmund Hale had never once seen there in all the years he had lived in Red Hollow. She looked like a woman who had just stopped waiting. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Mavis said, in a voice full of the specific outrage of someone whose certainty has just been publicly disturbed, "Well, I never." And Clara Whitman walked back to her small room above the laundry and began to pack. She did not have much to pack. That had always been one of the quieter griefs of her life, that she had built so little because there had seemed so little point in building when every door kept closing. A few dresses, carefully mended, her sewing kit, her adapted tools, the ones she had made herself over years, handles rewrapped and angles adjusted for the grip of a hand that worked differently than most. A small book of her mother's recipes. A photograph of her parents from before the accident, before the mill, before everything that came after. She packed it all carefully and sat on the edge of her cot and looked at the wall of her small room, the water stain in the corner, the crack in the plaster she had never had any reason to fix, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But possibility, the feeling of a door standing open instead of shut. She had spent so long on the outside of every door in Red Hollow that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be invited through one. She was not foolish. She understood the reality of what she had agreed to. A mountain homestead at 9,000 feet, with a man she had spoken to for less than an hour, who was by all accounts difficult and distant, and as comfortable with silence as other men were with conversation. The work would be hard. The winter would be brutal. There was no guarantee of anything, not warmth, not welcome, not the kind of life she had always quietly imagined for herself. But he had not looked at her hand. He had heard everything Red Hollow had to say about Clara Whitman, and he had walked outside, and he had watched her pick up a child's basket from the mud, and he had decided something different. That mattered to her. She couldn't have explained to anyone, rationally, exactly why it mattered so much. Only that she had been looked at a certain way for so long, the particular look, the quick downward glance to her right hand, the flicker of reassessment, the subtle withdrawal that being looked at differently felt like stepping into warmth after a very long cold. She sat with that feeling for a while. Then she finished packing. She set her bag by the door. She blew out the lamp. And she lay down in the dark of her small room above the laundry in Red Hollow, Colorado, and listened to the wind coming off the mountains. And for the first time in a very long time, she was looking forward to the morning. Ruth Alderman came to find her an hour before first light. Clara heard the knock and was already awake, already dressed, sitting on the edge of her packed cot with her hands loose in her lap. "Come in," she said. Ruth came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the bag, looking at Clara, doing the mathematics of the situation. "You're actually going," Ruth said. "I am," Clara said. "Clara." Ruth crossed her arms. She was wearing her housecoat and her expression was one of genuine worry, which Clara appreciated, even when it came wrapped in the packaging of someone who thought they knew better. "You've known this man for one afternoon. I've known the men who rejected me my whole life," Clara said. "Knowing someone for a long time doesn't mean they see you." Ruth was quiet. "He might be dangerous," she said finally. "He lives alone in the mountains. He doesn't talk to anyone. Nobody knows what kind of man he really is." "I know what kind of man he was this afternoon," Clara said. "And this afternoon is what I have to go on. What if it's terrible? What if you get up there, and it's nothing like what he said? What if he's not what he seems?" Clara stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at Ruth Alderman, who had been her friend for 11 years and had never, not once in all of that time, told Clara she was worth more than what Red Hollow had decided she was worth. "Then I'll come back," Clara said. "I've survived everything this town has done to me. I reckon I can survive being wrong about one man." She walked to the door. "Ruth," she said, stopping with her hand on the frame, "I want you to understand something. I am not going because I'm desperate. I am not going because I have no other choice. I am going because for the first time in a very long time, someone looked at me, the actual me, not the hand, not the history, not the 7 times I was turned down and said, 'I want that.' And I have been waiting for that my entire life." She paused. "I intend to find out whether it's real." Ruth opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Be careful," she said finally. "Always am," Clara said. She walked down the stairs, through the dark front room of the laundry, and out into the pre-dawn cold of Red Hollow's Main Street. Gideon Blackwood was already there. The gray horse was saddled. The pack mule was loaded. He stood beside them in the darkness, perfectly still, and when he saw her come out of the laundry with her bag, he moved to take it from her, not quickly, not with any ceremony. Just the natural movement of a man who had decided she was his responsibility and acted accordingly. "You're on time," he said. "I said I would be," she said. He tied her bag to the pack mule. He brought up a horse, a solid brown mare, sturdy and calm, well suited to mountain trails. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. He held the mare while she mounted, watching to see how she managed with the reins, saying nothing about her hand, making no adjustment to any expression on his face. She managed fine. He mounted the gray and turned north. And Clara Whitman rode out of Red Hollow, Colorado, at 4 in the morning on an October day, with the wind coming cold off the mountains and the last stars still visible, and the whole town asleep behind her. She did not look back, not because she didn't care about what she was leaving, but because she was finished being someone who spent all her time looking backward at the doors that had closed. The mountain was ahead, and for the first time in Clara Whitman's life, so was something worth moving toward. The road north out of Red Hollow was not a road in any sense that Clara had previously understood the word. It was a suggestion, a rumor of passage through terrain that had never fully agreed to be crossed. First 2 hours were manageable, a wide trail through the lower foothills, packed hard by seasonal use, bordered by scrub oak and stands of aspen already gone gold with October. Clara kept the brown mare at a steady pace behind Gideon's gray, watching how he read the trail ahead of them, how his eyes moved constantly without urgency. Scanning the tree line and the sky and the ground in front of the horses with the automatic attention of a man who had learned that the wilderness offered very little warning before it became dangerous. He did not talk during those first 2 hours. Neither did she. She had half expected conversation, or at least the awkward attempt at it that characterized most situations where two strangers were suddenly required to spend time together. But Gideon Blackwood did not appear to feel the social pressure of silence in any way she recognized. He rode as though he were alone, which was not rude. Exactly, he checked on her periodically with a backward glance, noted that she was managing, and returned to watching the trail. That was all. Clara found somewhat to her surprise that she didn't mind. She had spent most of her adult life surrounded by people who talked constantly and said very little, and the quiet of the trail was cleaner than the noise of Red Hollow. She could think in it. She could breathe in it. She watched the mountains rising ahead of them, enormous, indifferent, ancient, in a way that made all of Red Hollow's opinions feel very small, and she felt something she recognized after a moment as the early stages of peace. It didn't last, because nothing peaceful ever lasted very long, but she held it while she could. By mid-morning, the trail had narrowed to single file and begun to climb. "Stay to the inside edge," Gideon said, the first words he'd spoken since they left town. He said it without turning around, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the sound of hooves on loose stone. "How far inside?" she asked. "As far as you can manage without crowding the rock face," he said. "The outside edge is softer than it looks." She moved the mare left. Below the outside edge of the trail, a slope fell away into a gully she couldn't see the bottom of. "How far is this drop?" she asked. "Far enough," he said. That was the end of that conversation. She kept to the inside edge. The mare was sure-footed better on the trail than Clara had anticipated and responded well to the adjusted grip Clara used with the reins. The specific technique she had worked out over years of riding with a right hand that couldn't grip with full strength. She had told Gideon she could ride well enough, and it was true, but well enough covered a lot of ground, depending on what the terrain demanded. On this trail, on this grade, with this drop to her left, she was riding with genuine attention, constantly making small corrections, keeping herself and the horse in a zone she could control. She did not ask for help. At a point where the trail leveled briefly onto a flat shelf of rock, Gideon stopped his horse and waited for her to come alongside him. He looked at her hands on the reins. "Your adapted grip," he said. "Works better on level ground?" "It works fine either way," she said. "It's just different from what most people expect to see." He nodded. He did not offer to take her reins. He did not suggest she might want to rest, or that the trail was harder than she'd anticipated. He just noted the information and stored it the way he seemed to store all information, without commentary, without outjudgment, without any signal of what he intended to do with it. "About another 6 hours to the cabin," he said. "We'll stop at noon to water the horses." "All right," she said. He turned the gray north again. She followed. At noon they stopped at a stream that came down off the mountain in a thin, cold cascade, running over rocks and disappearing into the trees below the trail. The horses drank. Gideon handed Clara a piece of dried meat and a strip of something sweet she identified after a moment as dried apple, and they ate standing up because there was nowhere convenient to sit, and neither of them suggested looking for somewhere. "How long have you lived on the mountain?" Clara asked. 8 years, he said. "Since you came west?" "Since before that," he said. "I came west 7 years after the war. Spent a year in Denver." Decided Denver wasn't right. What was wrong with Denver? He chewed for a moment. "Too many people who wanted to talk about the war," he said. She understood that without needing more explanation. She had grown up in the years after the war. had watched what it did to the men who came back from it, had learned early that certain subjects were load-bearing walls in a person's interior, and you didn't push on them without knowing what was holding up the ceiling. "Family?" she asked, and kept her voice neutral, the way she asked things when she wanted to offer a person the option of not answering. He was quiet for a moment. "Wife and son," he said. "Fever 1867. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. He ate the rest of his dried apple. He did not add anything to what he'd said, and she did not ask him to. They watered the horses and moved on. By early afternoon, the terrain had changed substantially. The trail, such as it was, wound through dense stands of pine that blocked the sky and reduced visibility to 30 or 40 feet in any direction. The temperature had dropped by what felt like 15 degrees, though the sun was still high. Clara could smell snow in the air, which surprised her, because she had always thought that was something people said and not something a person could actually detect. She could detect it. It was cold and metallic and faint but unmistakable. "Is it going to snow?" she called ahead. Gideon glanced at the sky between the trees. "Not today," he said. "Tomorrow, maybe. We'll be inside by then." They would be inside by then. She turned that over in her mind, the cabin she hadn't seen, the 2 rooms he described, the reality of what she had agreed to that she was only now beginning to understand in full physical terms. Not the idea of it, the actual weight and dimension of it. She had said yes to a man she'd known for an afternoon. She was riding into the Colorado Rockies at 9,000 feet. She was going to spend the entire winter, in a 2-room cabin with a man who communicated primarily through silence and the occasional sentence. She examined this set of facts carefully. Then she examined the alternative, which was Red Hollow and Dorothea Price's voice, and the 7th rejection, and the sigh that meant girl is going to die alone, and she turned back to face the trail ahead. The cabin was better than she had expected. She did not know exactly what she had expected: something rough, something barely habitable, something that communicated the life of a man who lived alone at altitude and had stopped caring about comfort. She had prepared herself for rough. The cabin was rough, but it was not barely habitable. It was solid. The logs were chinked carefully. The roof was steep enough to shed snow. The door fit its frame without gaps. Inside, it was a single large room divided by a half wall into a cooking and working area and a sleeping area, with a second smaller room beyond a storage room. She would learn. For tools and preserved food, and the equipment that couldn't tolerate freezing. The cast iron stove was exactly where he'd said it would be, and it was a good one, the serious, heavy kind that held heat through the night if you banked it correctly. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wooden shelf along one wall with a row of books that surprised her. A bed frame with a rope lattice and a mattress stuffed with something that crackled when she pressed at pine needles, she guessed, or dried grass. "You can have the main room," he said. "I'll take the storage." "There's no bed in the storage room," she said. "I've got a bedroll," he said. She looked at him. "That's not, you don't have to." "It's practical," he said. "You'll need the fire at night." The storage room holds heat differently. He was already moving, pulling his gear off the pack mule with efficient movements, carrying things through the door with the purposefulness of a man who had decided and saw no reason to debate. "You'll want to look through the kitchen stores. Tell me what's missing." So she did. She went through the wooden crates and shelves with the particular attention she gave to practical problems, noting what was there and what wasn't, building a list in her head of what they would need before the snow came in earnest. He had flour, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, sugar, coffee, a good supply of dried and smoked meat. He had lard baking powder, a small quantity of dried fruit. He did not have enough of several things, and he was missing others, entirely things she would have included without thinking, items that made the difference between a winter that was merely hard and a winter that ground a person down. "You don't have vinegar," she said. He appeared in the doorway between the main room and the storage. "Does it matter?" "It matters a great deal," she said. "For preserving, for cleaning, for treating certain injuries." "It matters. I've been managing winters without it." "Then you've been managing harder than you needed to," she said. She kept her voice even, not challenging, just stating the fact the way she would have stated any fact. "I'll need thread. Multiple gauges. You've got one weight here and it's not right for everything. I'll need more lamp oil, you're going to run short if we're both working evenings. And I'll need a couple of specific tools I don't see here, things I work with differently than standard." He listened to all of this. "I can go back down in 3 days," he said. "Before the weather changes. Make a supply run. I can give you the list," she said. "Write it," he said. She found paper. She wrote the list in her careful hand. Her left hand was her writing hand, always had been, and her penmanship was good, and handed it to him. He read through it without comment, then folded it and put it in his vest pocket. "Anything else?" he said. "Not right now," she said. He went back to unloading the mule. That was their first hour in the cabin. It was, Clara thought, one of the stranger hours of her life, but not in the way she had feared. There was no awkwardness between them, exactly. There was something more interesting than awkwardness. There was the careful process of two self-sufficient people figuring out how to occupy the same space without colliding. Like two rivers finding a confluence. The current meeting and adjusting and moving forward together, rather than fighting over the same channel. She started a fire in the stove. He brought in wood without being asked. She started water heating. He fed the animals. She began to organize the kitchen area, rearranging the shelves in a way that made sense for the workflow of cooking. Putting the things she would need most at a height and position accessible to both hands, and he came in and watched for a moment without saying anything, and when she looked up, he simply said, "I can move that crate if it's in the way," and she said yes, that would help. And he moved it, and they did not need to discuss anything further. By the time the light was going, she had a pot of beans working on the stove, and he had checked the horses and the goats and fixed a loose shutterboard on the storage room window that had been banging in the wind. They ate sitting at the table, across from each other, in the lamplight, and it was the strangest meal of her life, not tense, not romantic, not awkward. Just two people eating beans and bread in a cabin at 9,000 feet while the wind picked up outside and the stove put out steady heat. "You cook well," he said. "You built a good stove," she said. That was the entirety of the dinner conversation. She did not know whether to find it funny or unsettling, and she ultimately decided it was neither. It was simply what it was, two people who communicated in fact rather than in performance, who did not fill silence with noise for the sake of filling it. She could work with that. She washed the dishes. He dried them without being asked. They moved around the small kitchen space without bumping into each other, which required a particular kind of unconscious spatial negotiation she usually associated with people who had lived together for years. "I'll be up before first light," he said, hanging the last pot on its hook. "So will I," she said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully read, not skepticism, not approval, something more neutral and more careful than either. "Sleep well, Miss Clara," he said. Nobody had ever called her that. It was not quite formal and not quite familiar, and it sat in some useful space between the two. "Good night, Gideon," she said. He went to the storage room. She banked the stove, laid out the bedroll she found folded on the rope lattice bed, and lay down in the dark of the main room of a mountain cabin, with the wind coming hard against the south wall and the fire ticking behind the iron door of the stove. She thought about Ruth Alderman, who was probably awake in Red Hollow right now, composing speeches about what Clara had done. She thought about Edmund Hale, watching her ride out of town. She thought about Gideon Blackwood's voice saying, "Maybe the problem was never you." She slept. She slept better than she had in 3 years. He was up before her, which surprised her because she had never in her adult life been beaten to wakefulness by anyone. She came out of sleep to the sound of the stove being opened and fresh wood being added, and by the time she sat up he had already started the fire and was pulling on his coat. "Stay inside this morning," he said. Temperature dropped overnight. "I need to check the horses and the roofline. There's ice on the north side." I don't want you on the slope before I've checked the footing." She thought about arguing with that. She thought about it for one full second. Then she said, "All right, I'll start breakfast." He went out. She started breakfast: cornmeal mush, fried salt pork, coffee strong enough to stand up without the cup, and while she worked, she listened to the cabin. She listened to what the building told her about itself, where the warmth moved, where the drafts came in, which boards creaked and which were solid. She listened to the mountain through the walls, the wind, the shifting of the trees, the occasional crack of ice. She was still learning the language of this place. She was a quick learner. By the time Gideon came back inside, stamping snow off his boots so it had snowed, a light early snow. Overnight breakfast was ready, and she had reorganized the woodpile beside the stove into a configuration that would be easier to access in the dark. He sat down. He ate. He looked at the woodpile. "That works better," he said. "I noticed you kept reaching past the larger pieces to get to the smaller ones," she said. "It makes more sense to split the stack by size." He looked at her for a moment. "How long did it take you to notice that?" he said. "About 4 minutes this morning," she said. "I watched you load the stove when you came in." He was quiet. Then he said, "You pay attention, always have," she said. "It's cheaper than asking for help." Something shifted in his expression, not softened. That wasn't the right word, but it was something like recognition. Like seeing a reflection of something you recognized from your own interior. "I'm going down the supply trail to the lower cache today," he said. "There are supplies I stored there before winter. I'll be back before dark. The cabin is safe, the door bar is solid. There are extra rounds on the top shelf if anything comes near the livestock. The goats especially, they'll make noise if there's a predator." "I know how to load and fire," she said. "Good," he said. He stood, put on his coat, looked at her for a moment as though making a calculation. "Don't go past the woodshed. The slope behind the shed gets icy fast, and there's no good footing once you're more than 20 feet out." "I won't," she said. He went out. She spent the day doing what she did everywhere she went. She made herself useful. She found the state of the cabin's organization bond that kitten she'd already addressed was adequate in a way that said a man who lived alone and didn't much care whether things were efficient, only that they worked. There was nothing wrong with it, but there was a lot of room for improvement. She spent the morning reorganizing the tool storage, noting what each thing was, and where it would make most sense to keep it based on how often it would likely be needed. She repaired a hem on a wool blanket she found folded near the storage room door. She found a gap in the south wall chinking small, but enough to let cold air seep in at ankle level, and plugged it with a mixture of clay and dried grass she found in a bucket near the door, which had apparently been left there for exactly that purpose. She checked the chickens, who were not pleased about the cold, but were managing. She collected 3 eggs. She found a goat that had somehow gotten her foreleg tangled in the pen railing and spent 40 minutes carefully working it free. The goat was not grateful. The goat expressed her ingratitude at high volume throughout the process. "You're welcome," Clara told her, straightening up. The goat gave her a look of profound contempt and walked away. She was washing her hands at the water basin when she heard hoofbeats on the trail, 2 horses, which meant Gideon was back but not alone. She dried her hands and went to the window. 2 horses. Gideon on the gray. And beside him, another rider, a man she didn't recognize, broad through the chest, wearing a heavy coat and the air of someone who had not been invited but had come anyway. Gideon came in first. "We have a neighbor," he said, which was his way of explaining, and also his way of telling her, without using the words, that she should form her own judgment quickly. "Cutter, he runs a small outfit about 4 miles east." The man called Cutter came through the door behind Gideon, and he was one of those men who made a room smaller just by entering it, not in physical size, though he was large enough, but in the particular way he occupied space. He took in the cabin in a single sweep, his eyes landing on Clara with the specific quality of appraisal that she had learned to recognize immediately and to dislike just as quickly. "Didn't know you'd taken a woman," Cutter said. He said it to Gideon, but his eyes were still on Clara. "Clara Whitman," Gideon said. "She manages the cabin." "Does she?" He was smiling. It was not a warm smile. "Where'd you find her?" "Red Hollow," Gideon said. He went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee with the ease of a man in his own home, which was a statement in itself. "This is my house. I am at ease in it. Your presence changes nothing about that." "Red Hollow," Cutter repeated. He was still looking at Clara. His smile had settled into something comfortable and presumptuous. "Pretty little thing. She seemed like she knows what she's doing." Clara set down the pot she had picked up. She looked at Cutter directly. "I repaired a gap in the south wall, chinking this morning," she said. "Untangled a goat from the pen railing. Organized the tool storage. Cooked 3 meals. What have you accomplished today, mister?" "Cutter?" Cutter blinked. It was the blink of a man who was accustomed to women becoming quiet when he walked into a room. He looked at Gideon, as though waiting for Gideon to apologize for her. Gideon drank his coffee. "She's straightforward," Gideon said in the voice of a man stating a fact he considered entirely positive. Cutter laughed, a short, sharp sound that wasn't fully a laugh. "I can see that." He sat down at the table without being invited, which Clara noted and filed away. "I came to talk about the winter boundary lines. The creek that runs the east side of your property has been shifting. There's some question about where." "There's no question," Gideon said. He sat down across from Cutter with the ease of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "The survey line is 18 feet east of the creek's current course. I had it marked before winter." "Who marked it?" Gideon said. "And it's documented with the land office in Denver. I filed the updated survey in August." Cutter's expression changed. Not dramatically, he was too practiced for that. But something cooled in it, some presumption that he had arrived, with some expectation that this conversation would go the way these conversations usually went, with a man who lived alone in the mountains and didn't have documentation. Who might be persuaded or pressured, that expectation quietly fell away. "You filed in August," Cutter said. "I did," Gideon said. There was a pause. Cutter looked at Clara. Clara was putting a kettle on the stove and appeared entirely unconcerned with him, which she was not. She was paying complete attention to every word. She was building a picture. "Well," Cutter said, "I may have been working from an older understanding of the lines." "You may have," Gideon said. His voice was flat and perfectly civil. Cutter stood. He put on his hat. He looked around the cabin once more, at the reorganized shelves, at the chinking repair visible along the south wall, at Clara standing at the stove, and something moved across his expression that was not admiration, was not friendliness, was something more like the recalculation a man does when he enters a situation he thought was one thing and finds it is considerably more complicated. "I'll be heading back," he said. "Safe ride," Gideon said. Cutter went out. The door closed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Clara said, "He's going to be a problem." Gideon looked at her. "Why do you say that?" he said. "Because he came here expecting to find you alone," she said. "And he came expecting to renegotiate a boundary line he already knows the legal answer to. That means he's not confused about where the line is, he's testing what he can take." She paused, turning from the stove to look at him directly. "And because he didn't look at me like I was a person. He looked at me like I was a variable. Something he needed to account for, because I changed the calculation." Gideon was very quiet for a moment. "You saw all that," he said. "I told you I pay attention," she said. He said nothing. But he looked at her with that expression. She was beginning to learn the one that was not quite surprise and not quite approval, but lived in some important territory between them. "He's been pushing on the east boundary for 2 years," he said. "Every season I'm away trapping, he moves something. A marker, a fence post, small enough that I could have missed it if I wasn't paying attention. But you were paying attention, he said. But it's harder to catch when you're one person. She understood what he was telling her. Two people are harder to move than one, she said. Considerably, he said. She turned back to the kettle. I'll learn the east boundary line, she said, if you show me on a map where the markers are. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I've got a survey map in the storage room. After dinner, she said. After dinner, he agreed. That was the evening of her second day on the mountain, and it was the first moment she understood, really understood, not just intellectually but in her bones, what Gideon Blackwood had meant when he said he needed a partner and not just a worker. It was not about the cooking or the cabin organization or the labor of keeping a mountain homestead running, though it was all of those things too. It was about the fact that a person living alone is always at a disadvantage to people who are not because they are weaker, but because they can only see in one direction at a time. Gideon could not watch Cutter and watch the trail and watch the east boundary and manage the trapping operation all at once. But two people could see in more directions. She spent the next 3 weeks learning the mountain. Not all of it, no one learned all of a mountain. Gideon told her once, and the ones who thought they had were the ones who didn't come back. But the relevant parts of it, the trails between the cabin and the lower cache and the trapping lines, the east boundary markers and the creek that was trying to redefine itself, the places where the snow collected and the places it blew free, the behavior of the goats and the horses in different kinds of weather. Gideon taught her. He was not an easy teacher in the way that a patient and gentle person is an easy teacher, but he was a thorough one, and he gave information without condescension, which was so different from what she was accustomed to that it took her several days to stop waiting for the condescension to appear. It did not appear. He taught her to read animal sign. He showed her the difference between a predator passing through and one establishing territory. He walked her along the east boundary markers and explained the survey methodology clearly enough that she could have explained it to someone else. He showed her the cache sites and the storage system and the way the trapping lines were laid out in relation to the terrain. He adjusted the handles on 3 tools in the cabin workshop specifically to her grip. Without announcing that he was doing it, she came in one morning and found them laid out on the workbench, handles rewrapped, angles modified usable in a way they hadn't been before. She stood looking at them for a long moment. Then she picked up the first one and tested it. It was perfect. She went out to the yard where he was splitting wood. The tools, he split a log. Yes, he said. You didn't tell me you were going to do that, she said. I noticed you were compensating, he said. He set up another log. Compensating wastes energy. In a long winter, wasted energy adds up. She watched him split the log. Thank you, she said. He looked up at her. You don't have to thank me for practical things, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the woodpile. You're welcome, he said. It was not until the end of the 3rd week that the first serious thing happened. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of the east side fence, the section nearest the boundary markers, clanging in the middle of a still afternoon when there was no wind, and the horses were in the corral, and the goats were quiet. She went to look. One of the boundary markers, a notched post set in concrete that Gideon had placed himself, was lying on its side. Not fallen. She could see from the way the ground around the base had been disturbed that it had been pulled. She stood there for a moment. She looked east toward Cutter's property. She couldn't see anything. That didn't mean nothing was there. She went back to the cabin. She found the survey map, which she had studied until she could reproduce the east boundary line from memory. She found the second set of stakes and the marking tools Gideon kept in the storage room for exactly this kind of situation. She put on her heavy coat and her gloves. She went back out. She reset the marker herself. It took her the better part of 2 hours, working carefully with her adapted tools, using the technique she had developed over years of performing tasks that required precision, and 2 hands that didn't always cooperate. The concrete wouldn't set until spring, but the stake was solid, and the position was exact, marked on the survey line within an inch. When Gideon came back from checking the far trapping line, she was washing concrete off her hands at the water basin. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her hands. He looked at the east fence line, where the replaced marker stood. He looked back at her. The third post from the creek was pulled, she said. I reset it. The position is accurate to the survey line. I checked it twice. He was very still for a moment. You're sure of the position, he said. I'm sure, she said. I've got the map coordinates in my head. I can show you. He crossed to her. He took her right hand gently, carefully, not as though he was examining it but simply holding it, looking at the raw skin around the base of her palm, where the concrete work had chafed against the scarring. Does it hurt, he said. It's fine, she said. That wasn't what I asked, he said. She looked at him. It's sore, she said. It'll be fine by morning. He released her hand. He went to the storage room and came back with a small tin she hadn't seen before, a salve of some kind, something homemade, dense and dark gold. He held it out to her. Bear grease and pine resin, he said. It'll help the skin. She took it. He turned to put his coat away. Gideon, she said. He turned back. He's going to try again, she said. Cutter. This isn't the first time he's touched that marker, is it? No, he said. And before you were alone. You couldn't catch it quickly enough to replace it, before he'd built the case that it was never there. That's right, he said. Now you're not alone, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before, something that was not quite relief, but was what lived underneath relief. The thing a person's face does when they finally set down something they have been carrying for too long. No, he said. Now I'm not. The weeks that followed built a pattern that Clara would not have been able to predict and could not have designed, because it grew not from intention but from the simple daily reality of two capable people occupying the same hard life. They divided the work without negotiating it. Through a process of mutual observation and natural adjustment, she took the domestic and small tools work, he took the heavy outdoor labor. But these categories dissolved regularly because work needed doing, and neither of them held back from doing it. She went out on the east boundary check every 3 days. He started leaving her more detailed notes about the trapping line layout, and she started leaving him detailed notes about the supply inventory, and gradually these notes became conversations, and the conversations became long. He talked more than she had expected once he started. He talked about the mountains as though they were a subject he had studied for years and was only now finding a student worthy of the material. He knew the names of the peaks and the rivers and the geological formations and the wildlife patterns in a way that was not merely practical but was genuinely engaged. He loved this place. She understood eventually. Not in the way people loved comfortable things, but in the way people love something that has demanded everything from them and given back something that couldn't be named. She told him about her family, about the mill, about growing up after the accident in a world that had decided what she was before she had a chance to disagree. She told him about the 7 rejections, not all at once, and not with complaint, but over several evenings, in pieces, because he asked questions and she found she didn't mind answering them. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and without performance. One evening she told him about Edmund Hale, the 7th one. He wasn't a bad man, she said. That's what I keep coming back to. He wasn't cruel about it. He just looked at my hand and thought through the practicalities and decided I was going to make his life harder. He was wrong, Gideon said. He didn't know that, she said. He didn't try to know that, Gideon said. That's different. She looked at him across the lamp. Most people see the thing that's different first, she said. That's just how people work. I've made a kind of peace with it. You've made a kind of endurance with it, he said. That's not the same thing as peace. She was quiet. No, she said. I suppose it's not. He was quiet too for a moment. When I lost my wife, he said slowly, And she stayed perfectly still, because she understood. This was territory he did not enter casually. The thing that hit hardest wasn't the grief. The grief was what it was. The thing that hit hardest was the way people looked at me afterward. Like I was already half of a story that was finished. Like anything I did from that point on was just aftermath. You left, she said. I left, he said, because I couldn't be someone else's aftermath. I needed to find out what I actually was. She looked at him. Did you find out, she said. He was quiet for a long time. I found out I'm better with someone who sees the same thing I see, he said. When I look at you, I don't see what those men in Red Hollow saw. I see someone who figured out how to be strong in conditions that were designed to make her think she wasn't. He paused. That's not a small thing. Clara held very still, the way a person holds still when something important is settling. No, she said, I suppose it isn't. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the mountain held them both in its cold and ancient dark, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. 3 days later, Cutter came back. He came in the afternoon, when Gideon was out on the far trapping line, which Clara suspected was not coincidence, and he came with a second man she didn't know. Younger and quieter, and standing just behind Cutter's right shoulder in the specific position of someone who has been brought along to imply something without saying it. Clara came to the door of the cabin when she heard the horses. She stood in the doorframe. She did not invite them in. Mr. Cutter, she said. Miss Cutter said. He looked past her into the cabin. Blackwood around. He'll be back shortly, she said. He nodded slowly. I wanted to talk to him about that east boundary post, he said. The one that appears to have been moved. The one that was pulled from the ground, Clara said, and replaced on the correct survey line. Yes. Cutter looked at her. The correct survey line according to who, he said. According to the survey map filed with the Denver Land Office in August, she said. I've got a copy inside if you'd like to see it. A pause. You know the survey map, Cutter said slowly. Chapter and verse, she said. Cutter's jaw moved slightly. He looked at the younger man behind him. He looked back at Clara. That post was in a different position before, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. You're thinking of where it was after you moved it, which is a different thing. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who has been accurately described and is deciding how to respond. Cutter looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not angry, it was more dangerous than anger. It was calculating. You're a long way from Red Hollow, miss, he said. She held his, she said, and I'm exactly where I intend to be. He held it another moment, then he turned his horse. Tell Blackwood I came by, he said. He'll know, she said. She watched them ride east until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then she went back inside and sat down at the table and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, how hard her heart was beating. Then she stood up, put the kettle on, and started making notes on a piece of paper, the date, the time, what Cutter had said, what the young man looked like, the direction they had come from, the direction they left. When Gideon came back 2 hours later, she handed him the paper. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it down on the table very carefully and looked at her. You were here alone, he said. I was, she said. And you held the line, he said. It's our line, she said. Of course, I held it. He looked at her for a long moment, and it was a different look from anything she had seen from him before, not the assessing look of the trail, not the teaching look of the boundary walk, not the careful quiet look of the evenings by the lamp. This was something more direct, something that had been arriving gradually, by inches, over the past weeks and had simply, in this moment, completed its journey. Clara, he said. Yes, she said. He picked up the notes she had made. He looked at them again. He set them down. Thank you, he said. She understood that he was not thanking her for the notes or for holding the line or for standing in the doorframe while Cutter looked at her like a problem to be solved. He was thanking her for being someone he could count on. And she understood, sitting in the lamplight of that cabin on the side of a mountain at 9,000 feet with the wind starting up outside and the stove ticking steadily and the east boundary post standing where it was supposed to stand. She understood that she was. The snow came in earnest the first week of November. Not the polite early snow of late October that dusted the ground and melted by afternoon. This was the real thing, the kind of snow that arrived with purpose and intention and did not leave. It came overnight, and when Clara got up before first light and opened the cabin door, she was looking at 18 inches on the flat ground and drifts against the north wall that reached past her waist. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she closed the door and went to start the stove. Gideon was already awake. He came out of the storage room pulling on his coat, his face carrying the focused expression he wore when the mountain demanded something specific from him. "How bad?" she asked. He said, "The North Corral fence will have a section down." "Snow weight. I need to check the horses first and then the goats." "I'll get the animals fed while you check the fence," she said. He looked at her. "The path to the goat pen will be drifted," he said. "Take the long rope from the hook by the door and tie it to the post outside. Don't go anywhere without it in your hand. I know what a guide rope is," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I'm telling you anyway." She tied the rope. She went to the goat pen. She came back. He fixed the fence section. They worked in the cold for 2 hours and came back inside with frost on their eyelashes and breath coming in heavy clouds and the specific satisfaction of people who have done necessary things competently. She made coffee, she made biscuits. She put 3 extra logs in the stove. "This is going to be a hard winter," she said. "Yes," he said. "Good thing you didn't go into it alone," she said. He looked up from his coffee. Something in his face moved. "Yes," he said again, but differently. That was the kind of conversation they had now spare, layered, carrying more in the space between the words than in the words themselves. She had come to understand his language over the past weeks, the way she had come to understand the mountain's language, through consistent attention, through the pattern of how things behaved over time. He was not a man who spoke his interior easily, but he was a man whose interior was there to be read, by someone willing to look carefully enough. She was willing. The days settled into the hard rhythm of deep winter, and Clara settled into it with them. The cold was not like anything she had experienced in the low country. It was not merely cold. It was a fundamental condition, an environment unto itself that required constant management and adaptation. The cabin stayed warm because they kept the stove fed continuously, which meant the woodpile required constant replenishment, which meant splitting, and hauling was a daily task shared between them without discussion. The animals required morning and evening care in conditions that made every simple task complex. The trail to the lower cache became a serious undertaking rather than a casual errand, requiring planning and preparation, and equipment, and 2 people who both understood the risks. They worked well together. Clara had worked alongside people before in Red Hollow. There had been plenty of cooperative labor, barn raisings and harvest seasons, and the kind of collective work that frontier towns required. But she had never worked alongside someone who accommodated her way of working so completely without drawing attention to the accommodation. Gideon didn't rearrange his approach to tasks so that she could manage them. He worked in ways that assumed she would manage them, which was a different thing entirely. He didn't slow down for her. He matched her pace, which on good days was fast and on cold days when her right hand stiffened was somewhat slower, and he made no comment in either direction. Nobody had ever done that. She thought about it one evening while she was mending one of his shirts by the lamplight, and he was making notes in the small survey journal he kept, updating his records of the trapping lines. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said, not looking up from the journal. "Why have you never once adjusted what you expected of me because of my hand?" she said. Not lowered it, not raised it to prove a point, just treated it as if it wasn't a relevant factor. He looked up then. "Because it isn't," he said. "Most people think it is." Most people are watching for what a person can't do, he said. I watch for what they do with what they have. He paused. You do more with a damaged hand than most men I've known do with two good ones. Why would I adjust my expectations? She looked at him for a moment. You know what that does to a person, she said quietly. Being expected to manage instead of being expected to fail. I know, he said. How? He was quiet for a moment. After my wife and son died, he said, the town I was living in expected me to fall apart. They expected it so thoroughly that every person I spoke to was already prepared for it. Already treating me as though it had already happened. He set down his pen. It took me about 3 months to understand that their expectations were going to become my reality if I stayed. That I would become what they were already seeing. He looked at her steadily. So I left. She understood him completely. You stopped being what they saw, she said. I found out what I actually was, he said. Same thing, different direction. She looked back down at the shirt she was mending. 7 men saw a damaged woman, she said, and I nearly started to believe them. Nearly, he said. No, she said. I didn't. She felt his eyes on her for a moment longer. Then he went back to his journal. That was the evening she understood something she had been carefully not naming, because naming it felt like more risk than she was ready for. But it was there regardless of what she called it, something building in the space between them, brick by brick, in the way things build when two people share hard work and honest conversation and the long evenings of a mountain winter. She did not say anything about it, neither did he. But it was there. The second week of November, the trouble with Cutter escalated. Gideon came back from the far trapping line with an expression she had learned to read as controlled anger not visible in his face, which remained level, but present in the way he moved. The specific economy of his gestures when he was managing something he did not want to mishandle. He came in, he sat at the table, he set down a folded piece of paper. This was nailed to the survey marker on the east line, he said. She picked it up. It was a letter, handwritten, formally worded, making a claim that the survey marker had been incorrectly placed and that the east boundary of Gideon's property lay 12 feet west of its current position, which would put Cutter's fence lines behind what was legally Gideon's land, which would give Cutter access to the creek, which was the only reliable water source within a mile of the property line. At the bottom, a signature, not Cutter's name, a lawyer's name. An office in Denver. Clara read it twice. She set it down. He hired a lawyer, she said. He hired a lawyer, Gideon said. And a lawyer means he plans to take this to some kind of legal proceeding. County surveyor review, Gideon said. He can request one. They'll send someone out in spring. And until spring? Until spring the claim sits, he said. And if the county surveyor finds in his favor. He won't, she said. The Denver survey is accurate. We both know it is. We know it. The county surveyor will look at the evidence. Which is documented, she said. The Denver filing, the survey map, the date records you keep in that journal. She paused. Is there anything else? Any other documentation that establishes the boundary? He was quiet for a moment. There might be, he said. When I first filed the homestead claim, there was a government land agent who came out and walked the boundaries with me. He made a report. Denver Land Office, he said. With the original filing. Does Cutter know about it? I don't know what Cutter knows, he said. But a lawyer working for him would have requested all the existing documentation before filing a counterclaim. If that report is in the file, his lawyer has seen it. And they're filing anyway, she said. Which means either they think they can discredit it, he said, or they have something else. She looked at him. What's something else, she said. I don't know yet, he said. But a man doesn't pay a Denver lawyer to challenge a survey he knows he's going to lose. He thinks he can win. The fire ticked in the stove. The wind pushed against the south wall. Clara sat across from Gideon in the lamplight and felt the shape of the problem settle around them, not panicking, not retreating, just feeling the actual dimensions of it so she could think clearly. "The weather is going to keep you on the mountain until spring," she said. "Yes," he said. "But someone could go to Denver before the snows close the lower trails completely," she said. "Someone could go to the land office and look at the original filing. Look at what documentation Cutter's lawyer would have seen. Understand what they're working with." He looked at her. "The lower trail is still passable," he said slowly. "Barely. If someone left within the next 2 days and moved fast." She met his eyes. "I can move fast," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they both understood that she was offering to make a difficult ride, in difficult conditions, alone, to a city she knew only by reputation, to do research in a legal office she had never entered, on behalf of a property claim that was not technically hers. "Clara, I know the survey map," she said. "I know the boundary line. I know what we need to establish and what we're already missing. I can read a legal document and understand what it says." She paused. "And I can ride that lower trail. We both know I can." "The lower trail is one thing," he said. "Denver in November is another." "I grew up on the frontier," she said. "I've been in harder conditions than a city in November." "You'd be alone." "I've been alone my whole life," she said. "I know how to manage it." He was very still. "This is not your fight," he said. And she looked at him, and she said something she had not planned to say, something that came from a place she had been carefully not examining too closely. "That's not true anymore," she said. "And you know it." The fire burned. The wind ran along the eaves. Gideon Blackwood looked at Clara Whitman. Across the table of the cabin he had built alone on the side of a mountain he had lived on alone for 8 years, and for the first time since his wife died, he looked at something in front of him and recognized it as his. "2 days," he said finally. "You have 2 days to make it to the lower trail crossing before the south-facing slopes ice over." "I'll be on the trail at first light tomorrow," she said. He was quiet. "I'll write down the names," he said. The land agent, the filing reference number, the original survey date. He stood and went to the storage room. He came back with the journal. "I'll give you everything I have." "That's all I need," she said. He sat back down and opened the journal and began to write, and she watched his hands, large and scarred from years of work that had asked everything from them, moving carefully across the paper. And she thought that this was what trust looked like when it had been honestly earned. Not a declaration, not a ceremony, just a man writing down everything he had and handing it to someone he knew would protect it. She left the next morning. He was up before her. She came out of sleep to the sounds she had learned to associate with his particular way of preparing for something important, quiet, deliberate, no wasted motion. He had the brown mare saddled and her bedroll tied behind the saddle and a pack with supplies for the trail already assembled. He handed her the folded notes. "The land office is on Larimer Street," he said. The agent's name was Harlan Pruett. He retired last year, but his report will be in the filed record. "You're looking for anything that establishes the original line from the Eastern Creek boundary, specifically any witness statements or additional marking records." "I understand," she said. "If Cutter's lawyer has already been there," he said, "the clerk will know. They keep visitor logs for filed records." "I'll find out," she said. He held the mare while she mounted. He adjusted one of the pack straps without being asked. He checked the tie on the bedroll. Then he stepped back and looked up at her, and his expression was the most open she had seen it, not stripped bare. He was not a man who stripped bare easily, but opened the way a window is open when someone has decided the air inside needs changing. "Come back," he said. She looked down at him. "I intend to," she said. She turned the mare south. She did not look back, not because she didn't want to, but because if she looked back she would see him standing in the yard watching her go, and she understood that her resolve to be useful would be considerably less manageable if she let herself think too long about the look on his face when he said, "Come back." The ride down took everything she had, not because the trail was beyond her, it wasn't. She had learned it well enough, but because the early November conditions were serious in the way Gideon had described, ice on the north-facing sections, wind coming across the exposed ridgeline in gusts that nearly unseated her twice, the mare picking her way carefully through a section of trail where snow had obscured the footing, and Clara had to get down and walk it herself, testing the ground ahead, leading the horse through. She did it. She did it because she had been doing hard things her whole life, and because Gideon Blackwood had given her everything he had, and handed it to her, and said come back, and that was not something she intended to fail. She reached Red Hollow 2 days after she left the mountain. The town looked small to her now. She noticed it from the first moment she rode, in not the physical dimensions of it, which hadn't changed, but the way it fit in her mind. The last time she had been on this street, it had been the whole world. The trading post and the laundry and the church steps and the 7 rejections and Ruth Alderman's sigh. Now it was a stopping point, a place to rest the horse and resupply and continue south. She stopped at the livery to stable the mare. The liveryman was a young man named Ori, who had been 2 years behind her in school and had never said more than 10 words to her at any one time. He took the reins and then looked up and recognized her, and did a thing with his face that she had seen before and recognized as the expression of someone reorganizing their expectations. "Miss Clara," he said. "Ori," she said, "I need the mare stabled for 1 night, and reshod if she needs it. She picked up a stone on the South Ridge Trail, and I want her checked." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was not how he had ever spoken to her before. She got a room at the boarding house. She ate a real meal. She slept in a bed that was softer than the mountain cabin's rope lattice mattress, and felt somehow less restful. She saw Ruth Alderman the next morning. Ruth saw her first from across the street. Clara heard her name, called with the specific urgency of a woman who has been rehearsing this conversation. "Clara Whitman," Ruth said, crossing to her with the expression of someone who is simultaneously relieved and offended. You look well." "I am well," Clara said. "You look different," Ruth said. She's studying Clara, in the way people study someone who has come back from somewhere they couldn't follow and carry the evidence of it on them. "Your face is weathered," Clara said. "Mountain winters will do that." "How is it up there? How is he?" Clara looked at her steadily. "He's good," she said. "We're managing well. And he treats you." "He treats me the way a person treats someone they respect," Clara said. "Which is all I ever wanted." Ruth was quiet. "I'm glad," she said. And she sounded it. Genuinely. Underneath the complicated texture of a woman who had expected a different outcome and was finding herself revising. "I need to get on the Denver coach," Clara said. "Tell me what time it leaves." She made the coach. She sat in it for 2 days. With 3 other passengers she spoke to minimally and observed carefully, because years on the frontier had taught her that information came from wherever you were willing to look for it. And one of those passengers turned out to be a clerk from the Denver Land Records office, who talked about his work with the easy volubility of a man who assumed nobody was interested. She was interested. She learned, by the time they reached Denver, that the Land Records Office maintained a strict visitor log for all accessed files, that any documentation changes required countersignature from 2 clerks, and that the retrieval process for original homestead filings required a written request with the filing reference number. She had the filing reference number. Gideon had given it to her. Denver was everything Red Hollow was not: loud, crowded, fast, layered with the competing noise of commerce and ambition and the specific energy of a city that knew it was becoming something. Clara moved through it with the focused efficiency of a woman who had a clear objective and no patience for anything that was not that objective. She found the Land Records office on Larimer Street before noon on her first day in the city. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man with excellent posture and the expression of someone who had processed enough disputed claims to develop a deep personal skepticisms about everyone who walked through his door. "I need to access the original homestead filing for a property in the Colorado mountains," Clara said. "Filing reference 1871 CR 4000, 487. Name of Gideon Blackwood. The clerk looked at her. Your relationship to the filed claim, he said. Partner in the homestead, she said, which was true in every way that mattered, and technically supported by the arrangement they had made in October. The clerk retrieved the file. She sat at the records table and read it with the same careful attention she gave everything, not quickly, not impatiently, but completely. Page by page. She was looking for what was there, and she was looking for what wasn't there, and she was looking for any sign of recent access. She found all three. The original filing was solid. The land agent's report, written by Harlan Pruitt in August of 1871, was detailed and specific, describing the eastern boundary in terms that were unambiguous and supported by dated photographs of the markers, attached to the report on a separate page. The counterclaim Cutter's lawyer had filed was in a separate envelope clipped to the back of the folder. She read it, and then she sat very still for a moment, because she understood what Cutter's lawyer was doing, and it was considerably more sophisticated than she had expected. The counterclaim did not dispute the survey map directly. It disputed the chain of title on the water rights attached to the eastern creek. It was arguing that Gideon's water rights claim had never been properly filed as a separate instrument from the land claim, that the land claim established the property boundary, but that the water rights required a separate filing under the territorial water rights statutes, which Gideon had not made. If Cutter's lawyer was correct, the land was Gideon's, but the creek was not. She went back to the front of the file. She read the original water rights notation. She found it 3 pages in, a notation in Harlan Pruitt's hand. Water rights appurtenant to land claim filed per 1867 Territorial Statute Section 14. Creek access confirmed and recorded as integral to homestead claim. The notation cited a statute. The notation had a filing date. She wrote it all down. Then she looked at the visitor log. Cutter's lawyer had accessed this file 6 weeks ago. He had seen this notation. She sat with that for a moment. He had seen it and filed the counterclaim anyway, which meant he believed or was banking on the possibility that the notation was challengeable. That appurtenant to land claim was not the same as a properly executed separate water rights instrument under the current statute, which might have been amended since 1867. She needed to know whether the statute had been amended. She asked the clerk. The clerk, who was beginning to regard her with something between suspicion and reluctant respect, told her that yes, the Territorial Water Rights Statute had been revised in 1873. The revision had introduced a requirement for separately filed water rights instruments for any creek access claim filed after January of that year. Gideon's claim predated that revision by 2 years. So an appurtenant water rights notation in an 1871 filing, she said carefully, would be valid under the statute as it existed in 1871. Under the 1867 statute as it existed then, yes, the clerk said. But there's been some dispute in the county courts about whether the 1873 revision applied retroactively to prior filings. Has any court ruled on that question, she said. 2 have, the clerk said. 1 in Boulder County and 1 in Jefferson County. Both found that the revision was not retroactive. He paused. But those rulings are not binding on the Surveyor Review Board. She wrote that down too. She spent 4 more hours in that office, extracting every piece of information that could be extracted, taking careful notes in her precise left-hand penmanship, building a picture of the legal landscape the way Gideon had taught her to read the physical landscape, by looking at the whole of it, by understanding where the solid ground was and where it gave way. When she was done, she had 8 pages of notes, 2 case citations, a copied notation from Harlan Pruitt's original report, and a clear understanding of exactly what Cutter's lawyer was doing, and exactly what it would take to defeat it. She walked out of the land records office into the cold Denver afternoon and stood on the street and felt the shape of what she was holding. This was not just useful. This was the difference between Gideon keeping his land and losing half his water supply. She went back to the boarding house she had taken a room in. She sat at the small desk. She wrote a letter not to Gideon, because there was no reliable way to get a letter to a mountain cabin in November, but to a lawyer whose name the land office clerk had given her when she asked who in Denver had handled prior water rights disputes, a man named Aldous Marsh, who had argued the Jefferson County case and won. She explained the situation. She enclosed her notes. She asked whether he would take the case on contingency given that the underlying claim was solid and the counterclaim appeared to rely on a retroactivity argument that had already been rejected by 2 courts. She mailed the letter. Then she sat back and thought about Gideon alone on the mountain, managing the winter, watching the east boundary, keeping the fire going and the animals fed and the trapping lines running with the same steady competence he applied to everything. She thought about him saying, "Come back." She was going to come back. She was going to come back with everything she had promised to bring, and considerably more than either of them had expected. She left Denver 3 days later. The return trip was harder than the trip down, because she was riding into the weather rather than away from it, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees while she was in the city. She made Red Hollow in 2 days, rested the mare overnight, and started back up the mountain the following morning. The lower trail had deteriorated. There were sections she had to walk. There were sections where the mare didn't want to go, and Clara had to spend 20 minutes convincing her, patiently and without force, that the footing was better than it looked. There was a section where snow had come off a slope in a small slide and covered the trail in fresh debris, and she had to pick a line through it by feel and judgment. She didn't stop. She thought, while she climbed, about the look on the clerk's face when she had asked about the retroactivity question, that moment of recalibration when he had realized she was not there by accident and did not need things explained slowly. She thought about the 8 pages of notes in the pack behind her saddle. She thought about Aldous Marsh's office and whether he would take the letter seriously. She thought about the notation in Harlan Pruett's handwriting, water rights appurtenant to land claim filed per 1,867 Territorial Statute, Section 14. She thought about Cutter, who had hired a lawyer and believed he had found an angle. She thought about the fact that he had not counted on her. None of them ever did. The cabin came into view in the late afternoon of the second day of the return climb, and she saw smoke from the chimney, the good thick smoke of a well-fed fire, and she felt something she had not felt before, when returning to a place, something that was not merely relief at shelter, but something considerably warmer and more specific. She felt like she was coming home. She was 20 yards from the cabin when the door opened. Gideon came out without a coat, which meant he had heard the horse and moved before he had time to think about it, and he came down the steps toward her with the particular urgency of a man who had been waiting and is not going to pretend he wasn't. He took the mare's reins. He looked up at Clara. "You made it," he said. "I told you I would," she said. She swung down from the saddle, and her legs were stiffer than she'd realized from 2 days of cold riding, and she stumbled slightly on the landing, and his hand was there before she could think about it, steady, sure, catching her elbow and holding until she found her footing. "Careful," he said. "I'm all right," she said. He didn't let go right away. For a moment they stood there in the fading light, her arm in his hand, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, despite the cold, and neither of them said anything. Then she straightened. "I need to show you what I found," she said. "All of it. Tonight." He looked at her steadily. "Inside," he said. "You're half frozen. Everything else can wait 20 minutes." He took the mare to the corral. She went inside. She stood by the stove and felt the heat come back into her hands slowly, both of them, the good one and the bad one, wrapped around the mug of coffee that was already waiting, that he had clearly started before she arrived. And she thought about the fact that he had started the coffee before she arrived, which meant he had been watching the trail. Which meant he had been watching for her. She was still turning that over when he came in. He sat across the table. She laid out the 8 pages of notes. She walked him through everything: the original filing, Harlan Pruitt's report, the counterclaim, the water rights question, the statutory revision, the 2 county court rulings, Aldous Marsh. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "He's not going after the land," he said. "No," she said. "He's going after the creek. Without the creek. Without the creek, the east grazing section is too dry to use in summer," she said. "You'd have to regrade your entire livestock operation." "And he'd have the water," Gideon said. "And he'd have the water," she said. "Which is worth considerably more than the land he'd have to give up to establish the claim." He looked at the 8 pages. "You found all of this in 3 days," he said. "I found all of this because you gave me the right information to start with," she said. "And because I paid attention." He looked at her. There was something happening in his expression that she had learned to read over the past weeks, that process of things arriving in him, that moved slowly through layers before they reached his face. It was moving through those layers now. "The lawyer," he said. "Marsh. You think he'll take it?" "I think the letter I wrote him gave him enough to know this is winnable," she said. "And I think a man who argued the Jefferson County case already knows how to beat the retroactivity argument. And if he doesn't take it, then I'll find one who will," she said. "Or I'll walk into that surveyor review board myself with the Pruitt notation and the case citations and make the argument without a lawyer." He looked at her for a long time. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something," he said, and his voice was different, not uncertain. Gideon was not a man who spoke uncertainly, but careful in the specific way of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and is now choosing their words with the full weight of that time behind them. She waited. "When I came to Red Hollow," he said, "I told myself I was looking for someone to help manage the homestead. Someone practical, someone strong enough to handle the work." He paused. That was true as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole of it. He looked at the table for a moment. "I've been alone on this mountain for 8 years. I told myself that was what I wanted, that I'd made peace with it." He looked up. "I hadn't made peace with it. I'd just stopped fighting it." "Which isn't the same thing." She held still. "When I saw you in Red Hollow," he said, "something I thought was finished started back up again. I don't know a better way to say it than that." The fire in the stove ticked steadily. Outside, the mountain held its deep winter quiet. Clara looked at Gideon Blackwood across the table, this man who had crossed the world and climbed a mountain and lived alone in the cold for 8 years and come back down one October afternoon and walked toward her without hesitation. "I think," she said carefully, "that the same thing happened to me." He was very still. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm not a person who says things she isn't sure of," she said. Something in his face moved, not broke open, because he was not a man who broke open easily, but shifted in a way that changed everything it contained. He reached across the table. He set his hand over hers, her right hand, the damaged one, the one every other man had looked at and looked from, and he held it with a steadiness that was not delicate and not performative, just completely certain. She turned her hand under his and held back. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and inside the stove burned, and on the mountain the snow settled deeper on the slopes that had been building toward this particular winter for a long, long time. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. But then 3 days later the mountain gave them something neither of them had prepared for. It started as a normal morning. Gideon left before first light to check the far northern trapping line, the one that ran 3 miles up a ridge trail that was passable in November, only in the early morning, before the snow softened with the sun. He estimated 4 hours. He told her so. He took the gray and his rifle and his pack and he went. Clara spent the morning on the accounts. She had started keeping careful household accounts. inventory and expenditure, and the kind of organized record-keeping that would matter in a legal proceeding, and she up in the third column of figures when she noticed the light changing. She looked up. The sky through the south-facing window had gone the color of iron. Not the soft gray of ordinary cloud cover, the specific dark pewter of a storm system coming in fast. She went outside. The wind had died completely. That was the detail that told her everything she needed to know. When the wind died in the mountains before a storm, it meant the storm was already here, pulling the air toward it, creating the eerie stillness that preceded the worst of what was coming. She went back inside. She checked the woodpile, good, substantial. She had added to it yesterday. She checked the animals, goats and chickens she brought into the lean-to shelter immediately. The 2 remaining horses into the corral, with the shelter access open. She checked the food supply, the lamp oil, the medical kit. Then she looked north, toward the ridge trail where Gideon had gone. 3 miles up, in a storm coming in fast, on a trail that was passable in the morning and became another thing entirely when the weather turned. She knew what she should do. She knew the rational, sensible, practical thing was to stay in the cabin, keep the fire going, prepare for his return, trust that he knew this mountain better than anyone and would make the right decisions about coming back. She knew all of that. She also knew the storm was moving faster than he could have anticipated when he left before first light. She knew the ridge trail had 3 sections of exposed traverse where a rider in serious weather needed choices made for them by someone who could see conditions on both ends. She knew the gray horse was steady but not infallible. And she knew with the particular certainty of a person who has spent enough time reading both the land and the man that Gideon Blackwood would push further than he should before he turned back. Because he was the kind of man who believed the work required doing and did not easily consider conditions. She went to the storage room. She put on everything warm she owned, in layers the way he had taught her. She tied the guide rope from the cabin door to the corral post. She saddled the brown mare, who did not want to be saddled and said so clearly, and Clara talked to her steadily while she worked the cinch with her left hand and the crook of her right arm, the specific adaptation she had developed for this exact task. She packed the emergency kit, the one Gideon kept specifically for situations where someone needed to be reached, extra rope, the fire-starting kit that worked in wet conditions, the medicine tin, the thick wool blanket. She took the rifle. She went north. She had 3 miles to cover on a trail that was deteriorating by the minute, in a storm that was building from the west, with visibility dropping as she climbed, and the mare moving carefully beneath her, because the mare was smart enough to be afraid, and smart enough to keep going anyway. She did not let herself think about what she might find. She thought about the trail. She thought about Gideon's voice, stay to the inside edge. She stayed to the inside edge. She thought about his voice. The exposed sections read left to right. Use the rock face if you lose the trail. She used the rock face. She found him at the 2-mile mark. The gray had slid on an ice section of the trail. She could see the marks in the snow where the horse had scrambled, and Gideon had come down hard on his left side on the exposed rock beneath the snow. The gray was standing 20 feet down the trail, unhurt, reins hanging, looking reproachfully at the situation. Gideon was upright. He had gotten himself upright, which told her he was conscious, and nothing was broken in a way that prevented movement, but he was holding his left arm close against his body, and his face was the specific color of a man managing serious pain. "Clara," he said when he saw her. "Yes," she said. "What are you doing here?" he said. "Getting you off this mountain before the worst of this storm hits," she said. She dismounted, steadied the mare, crossed to him. She looked at his arm. "What happened?" "Shoulder," he said. "Hit the rock when the horse went down. I think it's dislocated." She looked at it. She had seen a dislocated shoulder before, her father's, from a mill accident years before her own, and she knew what it looked like. It looked like this. "I need to check the joint," she said. "Clara Gideon." She put her voice somewhere between gentle and absolutely non-negotiable. "Let me check the joint." He was quiet. She checked. It was dislocated. The joint was out of position in a way she could feel clearly even through the layers of coat and shirt, the shoulder sitting wrong, the arm hanging at a wrong angle. "It needs to go back," she said. "I know," he said. "I've seen it done once," she said. "I know the method." "It's going to hurt," he said. "I need you braced against the rock face," she said. "And I need you to try not to resist the movement. The resistance makes it worse, Clara." His voice was strained but level. "I trust you. Do what you need to do," she braced him. She positioned herself. She used the technique she had watched once, years ago, and had never forgotten, because it was the kind of thing a person remembered when they understood that knowledge was something you carried until you needed it. It took 3 tries. Each time he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. Each time she readjusted, repositioned, applied the force from the right angle with the right support. On the 3rd try, the joint went back. He let out a breath that had been held for longer than was comfortable. She stepped back. "Better," he said. He tested the arm carefully. The movement was limited. It would need rest, but the wrongness was gone. "How did you know to do that?" "I watched a doctor do it once," she said. "I pay attention." He looked at her with those gray eyes, in the middle of a mountain storm, with snow coming sideways off the ridge. "You rode 3 miles up a trail in a November storm," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm aware," she said. "We can discuss it later. Right now, I need to get you on the gray before the trail ices over completely." She was already moving, collecting the gray's reins, checking the horse over quickly. "Can you mount?" "Yes," he said. "Your left arm goes in your coat," she said. "Not in the sleeve against your body, inside the coat, so the joint is supported." "Don't use it." "Understood," he said. She helped him mount with a matter-of-factness that left no room for anything being remarkable, because she understood that a proud man accepted help more easily when it was offered as a practical procedure rather than as a concession. She mounted the mare. "Stay behind me," she said. "I know this section of the trail." "You've been on it exactly once," he said. "Twice now," she said. "Stay behind me." She led them back down. It took an hour and a half. The storm closed in around them like a fist, the visibility dropping to 20 feet, and then to 10, the split disappearing in places and requiring her to feel for it by instinct and the memory of how the ground sat beneath the snow. She talked to the mare the whole way down, low, steady, continuous, and she heard him behind her, the sound of the gray's hooves following hers, and she focused on nothing except the next 10 feet of trail, and then the 10 feet after that. They came out below the tree line. The cabin materialized through the snow. She got the horses into the corral. She got Gideon inside. She got the stove roaring. She got his wet outer layers off him, with a focus and efficiency that he submitted to without argument, which told her more about how much pain he was in than anything else could have, because Gideon Blackwood did not submit to things without reason. She made the fire. She made the medicine tea she had learned from the supplies in the tin. She packed his shoulder with the warming poultice she improvised from what she had. She sat beside him at the table, while the storm howled outside and the cabin held against it, and the fire burned. He looked at her for a long time. "You came after me," he said. "Yes," she said. Why? She looked at him steadily. "Because this mountain is not going to take the only person who has ever looked at me and seen what was actually there," she said. "Because I am not going to sit in this cabin and wait while someone I care about is in danger on a trail I know." She paused. "And because you would have done the same for me, and you know it." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly, "I would have." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Clara Whitman sat beside the man who had crossed a mountain to find her and understood for the first time in her life what it meant to be exactly where she belonged. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of wind that ran along the eaves like something alive, of snow that built against the walls until the cabin sat half buried in white silence of the kind of cold that crept through every gap and demanded constant attention to counter. 4 days in which the world contracted to the size of one room, one fire, 2 people, and everything that existed in the space between them. Gideon's shoulder healed the way he did everything, steadily and without complaint. He was not a good patient in the conventional sense. He did not rest well. On the second day of the storm, he was already trying to split wood one-handed, and Clara found him at the chopping block in the yard with his left arm strapped to his body inside his coat, and his right arm doing the work and looking entirely unrepentant about it. "Inside," she said. "The woodpile is adequate for 2 more days, and I checked it this morning," she said. "Inside." He looked at her. "You're going to be difficult about this," he said. "I'm going to be correct about this," she said. "There's a difference." He came inside. He was, she discovered, a man who healed better when he had something to occupy his mind, so she gave him things. She brought him the survey journal and asked him to walk her through every entry related to the east boundary, every measurement and date and notation, building the case record from his own documentation. She asked him to explain the trapping line system in enough detail that she could manage it herself if she needed to, not because she expected to, but because he needed to be useful and she needed the information, and both things were simultaneously true. She asked him questions about the mountain that weren't strictly necessary, but that she genuinely wanted to know, and he answered them in the way he answered things when he was engaged, thoroughly, with the particular depth of a man who had spent years learning something and was only now finding someone who wanted to hear it. They talked for 4 days in a way that Clara had never talked with anyone in her life. Not the performance of conversation that most social interaction required, the careful management of what you revealed and what you withheld, the constant calibration of how much of yourself was acceptable to show. This was something else. This was the kind of conversation that happened between people who had seen each other in the actual difficult conditions of an actual difficult life and had run out of reasons to pretend to be simpler than they were. She told him about her father, about the mill accident and what came before it and what came after it. She told him about the years of watching her mother manage a husband who had never fully recovered from the guilt of what happened to Clara's hand, the way guilt turned inward could become a kind of selfishness, the way it had gradually made her mother's life smaller and smaller until there was not enough space in it for anyone to breathe. He listened without flinching. "You've been carrying other people's feelings about your hand for a long time," he said. "Most of my life," she said. "That's a heavy thing to carry," he said. "You get used to the weight," she said. "And then one day someone points out that you don't have to carry it, and you realize you've been so used to it that you forgot it wasn't yours." He was quiet for a moment. "I carried the guilt about Margaret for years," he said. Margaret, his wife. He had not said her name before in Clara's hearing. "Convinced myself that if I'd been home instead of at work, she wouldn't have gotten sick. That I should have seen it coming sooner. Found a better doctor." He paused. "My son was 3 years old. There was nothing I could have done differently that would have changed what the fever did." "Did you believe that?" she said. "Eventually, I believe it now," he said. "It took the mountain to teach it to me. When you're alone up here long enough, you get very clear about what you actually control and what you only thought you did." She looked at him. "And what did you actually control?" she said. "My choices, spent my time. What I did with what I had." He met her eyes. "Same thing you controlled. Nothing more. Nothing less." "And was it enough?" she said. "You're here," he said. "I'd say it was enough." The fire burned. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls. Clara sat across the table from Gideon Blackwood and felt the extraordinary peculiarity of being completely known by someone and finding that it was not frightening. It was the most restful thing she had ever experienced. On the morning of the 5th day, the storm broke. They came out of it into a world made new and quiet and brutal in its beauty, the mountain remade in white. The pines waited and still. The sky the specific deep blue that only existed above a certain altitude after a serious storm had moved through and taken the haze with it. Gideon stood in the doorway of the cabin and assessed with his surveyor's eye. The north corral fence had another section down. The roof of the chicken lean-to had partially collapsed under the snow load. The path to the cache was buried. "Long day," he said. "Long day," she agreed. They worked it together. She rebuilt the chicken shelter. While he repaired the fence, his shoulder was better, functional, still sore in the way she could read from how he positioned himself, but not limited in the way that prevented work. She shoveled the path to the cache. He checked the trapping lines accessible from the cabin. By late afternoon, they had addressed everything that needed addressing. She was on her way back from the cache when she heard him call her name. Not urgently, not the sound of something wrong, but with a specific quality she had learned to recognize as the precursor to something important. She went to him. He was standing at the east fence line, looking at the boundary marker post she had reset in November. Looking at the ground around it. She came up beside him and looked. Someone had been at the marker. Recently, within the last 24 hours, while the storm was still clearing, which meant they had come up from the east in the tail of the storm, when most sensible people were still inside. The ground around the post showed boot prints in the new snow, and the marker itself had been disturbed, not pulled this time, something more subtle. She crouched down and looked carefully. A cut, in the wood of the post itself. Above the concrete, in the section that stood clear of the ground. A deliberate cut made with a saw. "He's marked it," she said. "To make it look like an old post," Gideon said, his voice level and very cold. "An old post that was already there when I filed the claim." She stood. "He can't argue it was never there if it's set in concrete," she said. "So he's trying to argue it was there before your homestead, that you're using an existing marker that predates your filing as your boundary evidence. Which would raise a question about what the original marker actually established," he said. "And who placed it?" she said. She looked at the cut marks. "This is not a legal argument. This is fabrication." "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. "He's getting desperate," she said. "Desperate men make mistakes, or they get more dangerous," he said. She held his gaze. He was right. Both things were true. "We document this," she said, "now before anything else. The boot prints, the cut marks, the date, the exact position of the marker relative to the survey line. Everything. I'll get the journal," he said. "They documented everything." She sketched the cut marks with a careful hand she used for anything that needed to be right. He wrote the measurements and the date, and the compass bearing of the approach tracks in the snow. They were thorough and fast because the light was going and the temperature was dropping, and they both understood that evidence waited for no one. When they came back inside, she went directly to the writing desk. She wrote a second letter to Aldous Marsh in Denver. She described what they had found. She attached her sketches. She described what she believed Cutter was constructing and why it constituted deliberate falsification of evidence in a legal proceeding. "Can we get this to Denver?" she said. "The lower trail will be passable in 2 days," he said. "I can ride it. Is functional," he said. "And this doesn't wait." She looked at him. "We go together," she said. He paused. "Can be secured for 2 days," she said. "Gideon, we go together." He was quiet for a moment. "Together," he said. They left 2 days later. The ride down was easier than her November solo trip, partly because the trail had been used more recently and was in better shape, partly because she was not riding into uncertainty this time. She knew what she was doing. She knew where she was going. And she was riding beside someone instead of away from someone, which changed the entire texture of the journey. Gideon rode with his left arm easier now. The shoulder recovered enough for the reins, and he rode the way he did everything with complete attention and no wasted motion. She matched his pace without thinking about it. And somewhere in the first hour of the trail, she realized they were riding in the specific easy synchrony of people who have been working alongside each other long enough that their rhythms have converged without either of them arranging it. When did you first know? She said somewhere in the second hour. He looked at her sideways. Know what? He said. That you were going to choose me, she said. In Red Hollow. Was it when you saw me with the child or before? He was quiet for a moment, which meant he was actually thinking about it rather than reaching for a convenient answer. Before, he said. She waited. I heard them talking about you in the trading post, he said. Describing you, the hand, the rejections, what they thought your future was worth. He paused. And something in the way they talked about you made me angry in a specific way. Not a general way, a specific one. He looked at the trail ahead. When something makes you angry in a specific way, it usually means you're already invested. She considered that. I was angry at the trading post counter when Edmund Hale slid that letter back, she said. Specific anger. What kind, he said. The kind where you understand that the person in front of you is not seeing you clearly, she said. And you're furious about it, but you're not surprised, which is its own kind of terrible. Yes, he said. They rode for a while. I was also afraid, she said. He looked at her. When you walked toward me, she said. I was afraid. Because I had been hoping for something like that for so long that when it actually appeared, I didn't trust it. I thought you must be making a mistake. I wasn't making a mistake, he said. I know that now, she said. Did you know it then? She thought about it. I knew enough, she said. I knew enough to say yes. He looked at her for a moment. Good, he said. They reached Red Hollow by evening. Clara had known, in an abstract way, that returning to Red Hollow would be different from the November stopover. In November, she had moved through the town with purpose and speed, had spoken to Ruth and Ori and a few others, and had not paused to examine the experience. This time she arrived beside Gideon Blackwood, in daylight, with the particular bearing of a woman who had 3 months on a mountain doing difficult things competently, and the difference was not subtle. She felt it the moment they rode in. People stopped. She had been watched in Red Hollow her whole life, but it had always been the watching of people observing something they had already categorized. This was different. This was the watching of people who were revising. Dorothea Price was the first one she saw, standing outside the dry goods store with a package under her arm, and Dorothea's face went through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 2 seconds. Recognition, surprise, reassessment, and something that Clara generously identified as discomfort. Clara nodded to her pleasantly. Dorothea nodded back. That was something. Ori took the horses at the livery, and this time he was not the slightly tongue-tied young man she had encountered in November. He was brisk and professional, and called her ma'am again, but with the ease of someone who had had time to adjust to the idea. Ruth found her at the boarding house. Ruth came in without knocking, which was Ruth, and she stood in the doorway of Clara's room with an expression that was a complicated mixture of things and would have taken a more patient person than Clara was at this moment to unpick. You look different, Ruth said. You said that in November, Clara said. You look even more different now, Ruth said. She came in. She sat on the edge of the bed without being invited, which was also Ruth. There's something I need to tell you. Clara turned from where she had been organizing her pack. All right, she said. Edmund Hale has been asking about you, Ruth said. Clara waited. Specifically about whether you'd come back and whether things had gone badly up there. Ruth looked uncomfortable. He said he'd heard some things about Blackwood, about the land dispute with Cutter. What kind of things? Clara said. That Cutter might have the stronger legal position, Ruth said. That Blackwood might lose the east section of his property. That if that happened, I might come back to Red Hollow without a future, Clara said. Ruth was quiet. Yes, she said. That's what he was implying. Clara stood very still for a moment. Edmund Hale turned me down, she said. 7 rejections, Ruth. and now that there might be trouble, he's checking to see if I'm available." "I'm not defending it," Ruth said quickly. "I'm telling you because you need to know what's being said." "What else is being said?" Clara said. "That Cutter has a Denver lawyer. That the Surveyor Review Board meets in April. That Blackwood's claim might not hold." Ruth looked at her. "Clara, people are worried about you." "Which people?" Clara said. "I am," Ruth said simply. "I'm worried about you." Clara sat down. She looked at Ruth Alderman, this woman who had been her friend for 11 years, who had never once told her she was worth more than what Red Hollow said she was, who had said it's not personal on the worst afternoon of Clara's previous life and had been wrong, but had come to find her in the dark before she left, and had said be careful and had meant it with genuine fear. "Ruth," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening," Ruth said. "I am not coming back to Red Hollow," Clara said. "Not because Cutter's claim fails, not because it succeeds. Not because Gideon's land is secure and not because it isn't. I am not coming back because that mountain is my home now and Gideon Blackwood is—" She stopped, chose the word carefully, "mine. And I am his. And that is not going to change because of what Edmund Hale or Cutter or anyone else in this town decides to think about it." Ruth was very quiet. "Yes," Clara said. It was the first time she had said it aloud. It settled around her the way a true thing settles when it is finally given its right name. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Then I hope you win," she said. "I genuinely do. We came prepared." The meeting with Aldous Marsh was the next morning. He had a small office on Larimer Street, not grand, but organized in the way of a man who knew where everything was and why. He was in his 50s, compact and sharp-eyed, with the specific manner of a lawyer who had been in enough courtrooms to have stopped performing and started simply working. He stood when they came in. He looked at Gideon, and then he looked at Clara, and something in the assessment he made was the kind Clara recognized as intelligent and fair. "Miss Whitman," he said. "I got your letters, both of them?" she said. "Both," he said. "Sit down." They sat. Marsh opened a folder on his desk that was, Clara could see, her own letters along with what appeared to be his research notes. "I've been looking into this since your first letter," he said. "I want to ask you some questions before I tell you what I've found." "Ask," Gideon said. "The original marker, the one that was reset in October and then cut in February. Is the concrete foundation still intact?" "Yes," Clara said. "The cut was above the foundation line. The concrete is original. And you've documented the cut marks. Date, description, sketch, compass bearing of the approach tracks," she said. "It's all in the letter." Marsh looked at her. "You did that yourself," he said. "I did," she said. "Before or after you notified Mr. Blackwood?" "With him," she said. "Immediately after we found the marks." Marsh nodded slowly. He looked at his notes. "The retroactivity argument Cutter's lawyer is making," he said. "It's the same argument I defeated in Jefferson County 2 years ago. The 1873 revision was explicitly prospective. There's legislative history on that point, to committees from the Territorial Assembly that make the intent clear." He looked up. "His lawyer knows this. If he argued otherwise in a county court, he'd be sanctioned." "Then why file the claim?" Gideon said. "Because the Surveyor Review Board is not a court," Marsh said. "The board members are surveyors, not lawyers. They apply common sense and practical land use principles, not strict legal doctrine. Cutter's lawyer is betting that the board will look at the water rights question and think this should have been filed separately without knowing or caring about the legislative history." "And will they?" "Possibly," Marsh said. "If they don't have someone in the room explaining the legislative history to them." "Can you be in the room?" Gideon said. "That's what I'm here to discuss," Marsh said. He leaned back. "I'll take the case. My fee is a percentage of the land value at stake, paid if we prevail. If we don't prevail, you owe me nothing except the filing costs." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I believe in the claim, and I believe the evidence you've assembled is strong. But I want to be clear about the risk. What's the risk? Clara said. The fabricated cut marks, Marsh said. If Cutter's lawyer is sophisticated enough to see what you've built and decide to escalate, if he argues the marks were made by you, that you've manufactured evidence to support a counter-narrative, he can't prove that, Clara said. He can raise doubt, Marsh said. And doubt in a non-court proceeding where the standard of proof is less rigorous. Is the original marker position documented anywhere other than our records? Clara said. Marsh looked at her. She said again. Gideon shifted beside her. The land agent's report, he said. Pruitt's report has a photograph of the eastern markers. Dated August 1871. I know, Marsh said. I've seen it. Does the photograph show the marker position relative to the creek? Clara said. Well enough to establish general position, Marsh said. Not precisely enough to serve as a measurement reference. What if there were a second photograph? Clara said. Taken by someone other than the land agent, independently. Marsh looked at her. Is there, he said. I don't know yet, she said. But Pruitt walked that boundary line with Gideon in 1871. Did he go alone? Gideon went still beside her. He brought an assistant, he said slowly. A young man. Helped him carry the survey equipment. Did that young man ever come back? Clara said. Gideon looked at her. I don't know, he said. Then we need to find out, she said. She looked at Marsh. Pruitt retired. Pueblo, I believe, Marsh said. He was watching her, with the particular expression of a lawyer watching someone work. If Pruitt or his assistant kept any additional records of that survey photographs, field notes, anything it would establish the marker position from an independent source dated 1871, she said. Before any of Cutter's allegations about tampered markers. Yes, Marsh said, it would. Then we need to find Pruitt before April, she said. Gideon put his hand on the table. I'll go to Pueblo, he said. After your shoulder is fully healed, she said. Clara. After your shoulder is fully healed, she said. We have until April. We have time. Marsh was looking between them with an expression he was carefully keeping neutral. Miss Whitman, he said. You assembled this case essentially by yourself. We assembled it, she said. He gave me the foundation. Marsh looked at Gideon. She's right that you have time, he said. But I'd move on Pruitt before March, if Cutter's lawyer has the same idea. He won't, Clara said. How do you know, Marsh said. Because Cutter's lawyer is building a case based on what he believes we don't have, she said. He doesn't know what we've found. He doesn't know we've documented the cut marks. He doesn't know we have court precedent on the retroactivity question. And he doesn't know we're looking for Pruitt. She paused. A lawyer building a case based on incomplete information doesn't go looking for what his opponent might find. He builds with what he has. We're ahead of him. We need to stay ahead. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, when I argued the Jefferson County case, my opposing counsel was a man who had been practicing for 20 years. He was good. He looked at Clara. You'd have beaten him. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said. Will you take the case? I already said yes, he said. They left his office in the late morning and walked back through Denver's cold streets, and Gideon was quiet beside her in the way he was quiet when he was thinking hard about something. She let him think. She watched the city around them, the commerce, the noise, the layered ambition of a place that had decided it was going to become something, and she thought about Red Hollow and how small it had seemed when she rode back through it. She thought about Edmund Hale, checking to see if she might be available. She thought about Dorothea Price's face, going through 4 expressions in 2 seconds. She thought about Ruth Alderman saying, I hope you win, and meaning it. You know, Gideon said, breaking the silence, when I walked toward you in Red Hollow, I told myself I was making a practical decision. She looked at him. And was it, she said. The most impractical thing I've ever done, he said. And the best. She felt something move through her, not surprising. She had known this was what it was, had named it to Ruth the night before, but no less significant for being expected. Some feelings gathered strength the more clearly you saw them. "Gideon," she said. "I want to marry you," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him and looked at him on the busy Denver street with people moving around them and the cold coming off the mountains they had come down from, and the whole world going about its ordinary business. He looked at her. "That's my line," he said. "You were taking too long," she said. Something moved through his face that she had never seen theirs before, not the careful, settled quality she had come to know, not the controlled management of his expression in difficult situations. Something that was simply completely unguarded. He took her left hand in both of his. "I was planning to ask you on the mountain," he said. "When the snow cleared, I had a speech prepared." "What did it say?" she said. He stopped. "It said that I have been a man who survived things for 8 years, and you are the first thing I've encountered in 8 years that I wanted more than survival." He looked at her steadily. "And it said that if you were willing, I would spend the rest of my life making sure the mountain gave you back everything Red Hollow took." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a better speech than mine," she said. "You'll get a chance to give a better one later," he said. "Right now, Clara Whitman, will you marry me?" "I already asked you," she said. "You just said yes slowly." "Will you marry me?" he said again. "Yes," she said. "I will." He lifted her right hand, the one he was holding, and he held it against his chest, the way he had held it at the boundary marker on a cold November afternoon, with the same completeness, the same certainty. And he looked at her the way she had only ever been looked at once in her life, in an October afternoon in Red Hollow, by a man who saw what was actually there. They were married in Denver 3 days later. The ceremony was Small Marsh served as a witness, and a woman named Adeline, who ran the boarding house, served as the second, and a minister who asked no questions about the timeline, found them entirely credible as a couple. Which they were, completely, in every way that mattered. She wore her best dress, which was not very grand, but was clean and well-fitted. He wore his good coat. They stood in front of the minister in the small parlor of a church on a side street in Denver, Colorado, and said the words that people said. And Clara Whitman felt each word settle into the place where all the other words had failed to reach, the place where 7 rejections had built, a wall she had stopped believing could come down. It came down. When they rode back to Red Hollow the next day through, not past because they needed supplies, and because Clara intended to hold her head up on that street, and she intended to do it now, rather than later, the town did not disappoint. Word traveled as word did in small towns at approximately the speed of human curiosity. By the time they reached the main street, there were already people arranged along it, in the way that people arrange themselves when something is happening that they want to have watched. Clara rode beside Gideon. His ring was on her hand, a plain band he had bought from a jeweler on Larimer Street. No ornamentation, solid gold, fitted carefully to the damaged finger of her right hand because he had insisted and the jeweler had managed it. She wore it plainly, the way she wore everything she had earned. Edmund Hale was standing outside the feed store. She saw him before he saw her. She watched the moment he registered who was on the brown mare beside Gideon Blackwood, and she watched the series of calculations that moved through his face recognition. Surprise. The specific mathematics of a man understanding what he had given up, and beneath it, something she had not expected. Something that looked underneath everything else, like genuine shame. He stepped forward. Gideon's hand moved slightly toward Clara, the automatic protective gesture she had seen from him before, but she touched his arm briefly. "Let me," and she straightened in the saddle and looked down at Edmund Hale. "Miss," he started, then stopped, looked at her hand. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Hale," she said. He took his hat off. That meant something in the West. A man taking his hat off when he didn't have to was a man making a statement about respect. "I've been thinking," he said. He was speaking carefully, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed something, and is hoping the reality matches what he prepared for. I've been thinking that I made a wrong judgment about you. He met her eyes. Not about what you can or can't do. About what kind of person you are. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the afternoon when he had slid that letter back across the counter without a word of explanation. She thought about the specific quality of that silence. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I don't need your revised opinion of me. But I appreciate that you had the courage to offer it." He nodded. He put his hat back on. She looked at Gideon. "Let's get the supplies," she said. They moved on. Behind them, she could hear Dorothea Price saying something to Mavis, and she could not hear what it was, and she found she did not particularly care. At Harlan's trading post, Harlan himself served them, which was a change from the old days, when Harlan had stayed carefully neutral, and Clara had learned to ignore it. He was neither over-friendly nor stiff. He was simply professional, and he thanked them for their business when they left, and that was enough. Ruth caught her outside. "Married," Ruth said, looking at the ring. "Yes," Clara said, "in Denver's." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Is he good to you?" she said. "He is the best person I have ever known," Clara said. "And that is not something I say lightly." Ruth blinked. Then nodded. "Good," she said. "That's good." She looked like she wanted to say something else, and Clara waited, because Ruth was not a woman who ran out of things to say, and if she was struggling, it meant the thing she wanted to say was important. "I'm sorry," Ruth said finally, "for not saying sooner that you deserved better than what this town gave you." Clara looked at her. "You came to find me before I left," she said. "In the dark. At 4 in the morning, and you said be careful." She paused. "That was worth something. It was worth a great deal." Ruth nodded. Her eyes were bright. "You did well," she said. "Clara, you did well. I had help," Clara said finally. She went back to Gideon, who was loading the pack mule with their supplies, and looked up when she appeared with the expression she had catalogued over 3 months of close attention as the one that meant everything all right, without spending words on it. She answered it the same way, a small nod that meant yes. He went back to the loading. She helped him. They were heading back to the mountain by mid-afternoon, the supply-laden pack mule steady behind them, the trail rising north ahead. Clara rode beside her husband. She had been testing that word since Denver, and it fit cleanly enough that she had stopped testing it and simply used it, and felt the town of Red Hollow fall away behind her as they climbed. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected, perhaps, to feel something more dramatic, some resolution, some satisfaction at the specific reversal of what had happened to her in this place. But what she actually felt was quieter than that and more solid. She felt like a woman who had finished carrying something that was never hers and had put it down in the place where she had always known it belonged. Not in her hands, behind her. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon said. She considered the question. "About how different the same road looks depending on which direction you're going," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Better going up," he said. "Considerably," she said. The mountain rose ahead of them, enormous and certain and cold in theirs, and Clara rode toward it the way she had always wanted to ride toward something without looking back, without apology, with both hands on the reins and her eyes on what was coming. There was still Cutter. There was still the surveyor board in April. There was still Aldous Marsh, and the Pruitt question, and the cut marks, and the legal argument that needed to be made and won. There was still work. She had never been afraid of work. And for the first time in her life, the work was hers, not the labor she performed, to earn the approval of people who had already decided she wasn't worth it. Not the endless proving of herself to judges who had made up their minds before she walked in the door. This was different. This was the work of building something that was genuinely hers, on a mountain she had earned, beside a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning and had never once looked away. The trail curved north. The cabin waited above, and Clara Whitman Blackwood rode home. March came to the mountain the way all honest things came slowly, without announcement and with no apology for what it cost to arrive. The snow did not disappear, it retreated. It pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, exposing the dark earth beneath in long patches that widened day by day, while the north-facing side stayed buried under white that would not give up until April or later. The creek on the east boundary ran loud and fast with snowmelt, visible now in a way it had not been during the deep freeze, and its sound was a constant presence in the days leading up to what Clara had come to think of simply as the day. April 3rd. The Surveyor Review Board. She had been counting toward it since February. Gideon had ridden to Pueblo in the last week of January, his shoulder healed enough for the trip. And he had come back 8 days later with, in his expression, she had learned to read as controlled relief the face he made when something important had gone correctly, but he was not yet ready to call it one. He had found Harlan Pruitt, not just found him. Pruitt was 71 years old, retired in a small house on the south side of Pueblo, and he had the specific clarity of mind that certain older people possessed, not in spite of their age, but because of it. Because they had lived long enough to understand what was worth remembering and had organized their memories accordingly. He remembered the 1,871 boundary survey. He remembered Gideon Blackwood. He remembered the Eastern Creek boundary in particular because there had been a dispute about it, even then a neighboring claim that had tried to assert creek access rights before Gideon's homestead formally established, and Pruitt had documented it specifically and thoroughly because he understood the future value of documentation in contested terrain. He had field notes. He had 2 photographs. He had a sworn statement, which he gave to Gideon willingly, and with something that looked, Gideon said, like satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who had done his job correctly 30 years earlier and was now being given the opportunity to have that correctness confirmed. And he had something else, something neither Clara nor Gideon nor Aldous Marsh had known to look for. The neighboring claim from 1871, the one that had tried to assert creek access before Gideon's filing, had been made by a man named Samuel Cutter. Not the current Cutter, the father. Pruitt had rejected it. The rejection was in the original file, documented, dated, signed. The current Cutter's lawyer had seen that file. He had seen the rejection of his own father's creek access claim, and he had filed a new challenge to the same creek anyway, banking on the fact that 30 years was long enough for the original rejection to be buried under the assumption that no one would look that deep. When Gideon laid all of this out on the table the night he came back, Clara sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "He's been trying to take that water for 30 years. His family has," Gideon said. And Pruitt stopped it the first time. Yes, and now Pruitt is going to stop it again. Gideon looked at her. "We're going to stop it," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "we are." She wrote to Marsh that same night. Marsh's response came back in 10 days, and it was short and direct, which was how Clara had come to understand that Marsh communicated when he was confident. This changes everything. Bring Pruitt to Denver for the board meeting if he will come. His testimony on the prior rejection alone may be dispositive. You've done excellent work. She had read that last sentence twice. Then she put the letter away and went back to the east boundary check, because the work of the mountain did not follow legal victories that hadn't happened yet, and she was not a woman who celebrated early. Getting Pruitt to Denver was not a simple undertaking for a 71-year-old man in early spring in the Colorado mountains, and Gideon rode to Pueblo a second time in mid-March to make the arrangements, and came back with Pruitt himself, the old man on a steady mule, moving slowly, but without complaint, with his field notes in a leather satchel strapped to the mule's left side and the photographs wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Clara met them at the top of the lower trail. Pruitt looked at her with the sharp eyes of a man who assessed things for a living and had never fully retired from it. "This is the wife," he said, not as a question. "This is Clara," Gideon said. "She the one who found the cut marks?" Pruitt said. "Yes," Gideon said. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. "Good eyes," he said. "I pay attention," she said. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already decided. They brought him to the cabin for the night before the trip to Denver. Clara fed him, and he ate with the appetite of a man who had been on the trail for 2 days and was not too proud to show it. He told them, over dinner, about the 1,871 survey details that filled in the picture she had been building in her mind for months. The specific texture of what it had actually looked like when Harlan Pruitt had stood at that eastern boundary 30 years ago and documented what was there and what was not. Samuel Cutter came up while I was surveying, Pruitt said. Stood right at the creek edge and told me the water was his by right of first use. He forked another piece of salt pork. I told him first use didn't establish legal right under territorial statute. He told me I didn't know the law. He looked up. I knew the law. And you documented the confrontation, Clara said. I documented everything, he said. Always did. Because the ones who say they'll fight it later are exactly the ones who do. She looked at Gideon across the table. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that Pruitt's habit of documentation 30 years ago was the reason they were going to win. The board meeting was April 3rd in Denver. In a room in the county building on Arapahoe Street that had the specific institutional feel of a place where practical decisions were made by practical men who preferred evidence to argument and would respond accordingly. There were 3 board members, 2 surveyors and a land use administrator named Hartley, who had been in his position for 12 years and who Clara, in the 2 minutes she spent watching him before the proceeding began, assessed as a man who valued accuracy above all things and would not be moved by anything that was not specific, documented, and verifiable. She sat beside Gideon at the respondents' table. Marsh sat on his other side, composed and prepared in the way of a man who had done this before and knew exactly where he was standing. Cutter's lawyer was a man named Victor Aldine. He was younger than Clara had expected, mid-30s, polished, with the confidence of someone who had won enough cases to believe that preparation was for people who weren't already good. He had a stack of documents and a manner that suggested he found the proceedings somewhat beneath his usual theater of operations. She did not underestimate him. Confident young lawyers who had won things were dangerous, precisely because their confidence was not entirely wrong. The board chairman called the proceeding to order. Aldine went first. He was good. Clara gave him that without reservation. He presented the water rights question cleanly and with apparent authority, framing the 1,873 revision as having created a gap in Gideon's claim that had never been properly addressed. Using language that sounded definitive and technical, and designed to make the board members feel that disagreeing with him would require more legal sophistication than they probably possessed. He produced 3 documents: the current survey of the creek position, a Colorado territorial water use table from 1,874, and a legal opinion from a Denver firm, not his own, that supported his interpretation of the 1,873 revision's applicability to prior filings. The third document was a problem. Clara had not known about the third document. She kept her face level and passed Marsh a note. Outside opinion they retained. Do we know the firm? Marsh looked at the document. Wrote back Simmons & Cole, second tier. They've been wrong on retroactivity before. She wrote, can we establish that in front of the board? He looked at her. He wrote, watch me, Aldine concluded. He was smooth and he was thorough, and he sat down with the manner of a man who had just given a performance he was satisfied with. Chairman Hartley looked at Marsh. Respondent's counsel, he said. Marsh stood. He did not use elaborate language. He did not perform. He stated 3 things clearly and in order: the legislative history of the 1,873 revision, and the explicit prospective language in the committee records, which he produced in copy, the 2 court rulings that had already decided this exact question, which he cited with full case names and dates, and the Simmons & Cole opinion, which he addressed not by attacking the firm but by pointing out, with careful specificity, that the opinion had not considered the committee records and had cited neither court ruling, which meant it was not a complete analysis of the existing law. He sat down. One of the surveyor board members, a man named Cole, no relation to the law firm, leaned forward. "Counsel," he said to Marsh, "the committee records you cited. Are those on file with the Territorial Assembly?" "They are," Marsh said. "I have the retrieval reference number if the board wishes to verify independently." Cole wrote something. Hartley looked at Aldine. "Aldine, your response to the court rulings counsel cited?" Aldine was not rattled, he was too experienced for that, but there was a recalibration happening behind his eyes that Clara watched with careful attention. "The rulings are from lower county courts and are not binding on this board," he said. "That's accurate," Marsh said, before being asked. "They're not binding, but they are persuasive, and the board is free to consider their reasoning." Hartley made a note. Then Marsh said, "The board may also wish to hear from a witness with direct knowledge of the original survey and the prior water access claim." Hartley looked up. "What prior claim?" Aldine said. And Clara heard at the edge of something that was not surprise, but was its first cousin, the sound of a man encountering information he did not have. Marsh said, in 1871, when the Blackwood homestead claim was originally surveyed and filed, a neighboring claim attempted to assert creek access rights that conflicted with the homestead filing. The territorial land agent at the time documented and rejected that claim. The claimant was Samuel Cutter. The room went quiet. Aldine's face did not change, but his right hand, which had been resting flat on his documents, moved a small, controlled movement, the hand of a man pressing something down. He had known. He had known about the prior rejection and had filed anyway. Clara felt something move through her that was not quite anger. Anger was too hot for what it was. It was the cold, specific clarity of understanding exactly what you were dealing with. The agent who made that original rejection, Marsh said, is present today and available to testify. Hartley looked toward the door. Harlan Pruitt came in. He walked slowly, but he walked straight, with just a satchel over his arm, and he sat in the witness chair with the ease of a man who had told the truth in official settings before and found it required nothing special beyond accuracy. He told them about the 1871 survey. He told them about Samuel Cutter at the creek edge. He produced his field notes, dated, signed, specific. He produced the photographs which showed the eastern marker in its original position with a clarity that did not require interpretation. And then from the satchel, he produced the original rejection documentation. The paper he had written 30 years ago in his careful surveyor's hand, establishing that Samuel Cutter's creek access claim had no basis in law or prior use and was formally rejected. Hartley held it for a long time. He passed it to the other board members. He looked at Aldine. "Mr. Aldine," he said, "were you aware of this prior rejection?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be significant. "I was aware of a prior interaction between Mr. Cutter's father and the land office," Aldine said carefully. "Were you aware it had resulted in a formal rejection of a creek access claim?" Hartley said. Another pause. "I was aware of some documentation to that effect," Aldine said. Hartley set the rejection paper down on the table in front of him. "Mr. Aldine," he said. His voice was perfectly even and perfectly cold. "You filed a counterclaim to a water rights determination. You did so with knowledge that the same water rights had been previously claimed by your client's family and formally rejected by a territorial land agent." He paused. "That is material information that was not disclosed in your filing. The prior claim was made by a different party, by your client's father," Hartley said, "on behalf of the same property, for the same water access." He looked at the other board members. "I'm going to call a recess." The recess lasted 40 minutes. Clara and Gideon sat in the hallway outside the boardroom with Marsh and Pruitt, and nobody said very much. Pruitt drank tea from a flask he had brought. Marsh reviewed his notes. Gideon sat with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes forward, which was how he sat when he was containing something large. Clara sat beside him. After a while, he turned his head and looked at her. "You found Pruitt," he said quietly. "You thought of Pruitt." "You rode to Pueblo twice in winter," she said. "I thought of Pruitt and you went and got him." "That's not the same thing," he said. "It's exactly the same thing," she said. "That's what two people are for." He looked at her for a moment longer. He took her right hand in his. They sat like that until the board reconvened. The board did not deliver its ruling from the witness room. Hartley explained, with the measured precision that Clara had identified as his dominant quality, that the board was taking the matter under formal advisement and would deliver a written ruling within 30 days. He also stated, and this was the part that mattered in the room, in that moment, before any written ruling arrived, that the board was referring the matter of Aldine's disclosure failures to the Territorial Bar Association for review. Aldine received this information with the stillness of a man absorbing a blow he was too professional to let show. Cutter, who had been seated in the back of the room and had not been called to testify, stood up when Hartley concluded. "What does that mean?" he said. His voice was louder than the room required. "What does that mean for my claim?" Hartley looked at him. "It means the board will issue a ruling within 30 days, Mr. Cutter," he said. "I would suggest consulting with counsel about what that ruling is likely to contain." Cutter looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply held Cutter's gaze with the complete, unhurried steadiness of a man who knew where the ground was under his feet. Cutter looked away first. He left without speaking again. In the corridor outside the boardroom, Marsh shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Clara and shook hers with the same seriousness. "You built this case," he said. "We built this case," she said. "Miss Whitman, Mrs. Blackwood," she said. He smiled, a real one, brief and genuine. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "if you ever decide you'd like to read law, I know several men in Denver who would argue over who got to teach you." She looked at him. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. The written ruling arrived on the 28th day. Gideon read it at the table while Clara finished the morning dishes, and the stove burned steadily behind them, and the mountain sat in the particular quiet of late April, snow still on the high peaks but gone from the lower slopes, the creek running hard and clear with the last of the melt. She heard him set the paper down. She turned. His expression was the one she had learned over 6 months of close living, not the guarded version he wore in public, not the controlled version he wore when things were hard. The open one, the one that only appeared when something had settled into its right place. "Well," she said. "We won," he said. She stood very still for a moment. "The water rights?" she said. "Confirmed are pertinent to the land claim under the 1871 filing," he said. The board found the 1873 revision was not retroactive, citing both the county court rulings and the committee records Marsh provided. The prior rejection of Samuel Cutter's claim is noted in the ruling as relevant historical context. He paused. "And Cutter's challenge is dismissed with prejudice." With prejudice. He could not bring it again, she breathed. It was a very ordinary breath, the kind a person took 10,000 times a day without noticing. But this one she noticed because it was the first one she had taken since October that was not carrying the weight of that legal question somewhere underneath it. "The Bar Association referral," she said. "That's separate," he said. "Marsh says it'll take several months, but Aldine's career in this territory is likely finished." She thought about Aldine and his polished manner and his outside legal opinion that had not considered the committee records. "He knew," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "And he filed anyway," she said. "He thought we didn't know," he said. "He thought we were one person, alone on a mountain, with incomplete records." She looked at him. "He was wrong," she said. "Considerably," he said. He stood. He crossed to where she was standing at the basin. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with the directness that was simply how he was, no performance, no ceremony, Just the clear gaze of a man who saw what was in front of him and did not look away. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to let me say the whole of it without interrupting." She raised her eyebrows. "I'll try," she said. He held her gaze. "When I came off that mountain in October and walked into Red Hollow," he said, "I had not allowed myself to want anything in 8 years. I had convinced myself that wanting things was the problem, that if managed what I had and stopped reaching for anything beyond it, I would be safe from the kind of loss that had already broken me once." He paused. "I told myself I needed a partner, a practical arrangement. Something that could be explained in terms of labor and efficiency and winter preparation." He stopped. That was true. It was also the only version of the truth I was brave enough to say out loud. She was quiet. "The other version," he said, "was that I saw you standing in that street and something in me recognized you. Not your face, not your hand or your history or what the town thought about you." He looked at her steadily. "Something in the way you moved, the way you stayed when everyone else left, the way you held your head when people were saying things about you that would have flattened most people." He stopped. "I recognized someone who had been carrying something alone for too long. Because I was that person, and I had been looking for a reason to set it down." She felt something move through her chest, not sharp, not sudden. The slow, deep movement of something that had been there for a long time finally being named. "You set it down," she said. "We set it down," he said. "Together." She put her hand against his chest, her right hand the damaged one, the one that every man in Red Hollow had looked at and decided was the most important thing about her. He put his hand over it. "You are the best decision I have ever made," he said. "And I made it in about 4 minutes standing on a street in Red Hollow, Colorado, watching you pick up a child's basket from the mud. And every day since then has confirmed it." He looked at her. "I want you to know that. I want you to know it clearly, the way you know a survey line specifically, with evidence. Documented." She looked at him for a long time. "Documented," she said. "Documented," he said. She felt the words settle into the same place where all the true things settled, the place that had been built, stone by stone, over 6 months of hard work and honest conversation, and a mountain winter that had asked everything and given back more. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, with the same weight behind it that he gave everything he meant. They went to Red Hollow in May. Not because they had to. The legal matter was resolved, the survey line was confirmed, the mountain was theirs, and the water was theirs, and Cutter's fences had been pulled back to the correct side of the boundary without further confrontation. They went because Clara had unfinished business that had nothing to do with property lines. She had 7 rejections that she had carried for years like stones in a pocket, and she was going to go back to the place where she had picked them up and set them down in the road and leave them there. Not in anger, not in triumph, in the specific way of someone who has finally grown large enough that the weight of something small becomes apparent for what it actually is. They rode in on a Saturday, which was market day, which meant the street was full. Clara had known it would be. She had chosen it deliberately. She rode beside Gideon the way she always rode beside him, not slightly behind, not deferring, but matched, equal, occupying the same width of road. The town saw them. Dorothea Price saw them and said something to Mavis, and Mavis looked and then looked away in the specific manner of someone whose predictions have been publicly disproven and who has not yet figured out where to put that information. Harlan came to the door of his trading post. He nodded to Gideon. Then he looked at Clara and nodded to her with the same weight, the same seriousness. She nodded back. That was enough from Harlan. Edmund Hale was at the feed store again. He seemed, Clara thought, to be spending a great deal of time at the feed store these days. He saw her, and he did not look away, which she respected. He came down the step. He said, "Mr. Hale," she said. He looked at her, not the quick appraisal and assessment of the old days, not the evaluation of a man checking whether a woman was sufficiently useful. Just looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have some honest reckoning to do about. "I heard the board ruled in your favor," he said. "It did," she said. "I'm glad," he said. And then, because he was not a dishonest man beneath everything else, he said, "I was wrong about you. I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the afternoon with the letter. She thought about the silence of it, the letter sliding back across the counter, the absence of explanation, the way silence can be its own kind of cruelty without ever raising its voice. "Thank you for saying so," she said. "I mean that." He nodded. He stepped back. She wrote on. Ruth was waiting for her outside the boarding house, which meant Ruth had heard they were coming from whom and how. There was no way of knowing, because Ruth had always operated on a network of information that Clara had never fully mapped and was standing with her arms folded against her chest and an expression that was fighting a battle between dignity and visible relief. Clara dismounted. Ruth crossed to her. She stopped in front of Clara and looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done in 11 years of friendship. She pulled Clara into an embrace. Not the brief, socially correct version, a real one, the kind that said something that words were inadequate for. Clara held her back. "You did it," Ruth said. Her voice was unsteady. "You did all of it." "Yes," Clara said. "The legal business. The mountain. All of it." Ruth pulled back and looked at her. Her eyes were wet, which was not something Clara had ever seen from Ruth Alderman, who was not a woman who cried easily in public. "You were right. You were right, and I should have told you sooner that you deserved better than what this town decided to give you." "Ruth," Clara said. "I should have, Ruth." She held her friend's arms. "You came in the dark at 4 in the morning when I was leaving, and you said be careful. I heard it. It mattered." She looked at her steadily. "You were more of a friend than I gave you credit for. And I should have told you that sooner." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, the slightly unsteady laugh of a person who has been carrying something and just put it down. "You're going to make me cry on the main street," she said. "You're already crying on the main street," Clara said. "I am not," touched her eye. "Good Lord." She straightened. Composed herself with the efficiency of a woman who had been composing herself in public for 42 years. "Come to dinner before you go back up. Both of you." Clara looked at Gideon, who had dismounted and was standing at a respectful distance with the pack mule, and the look of a man who was entirely comfortable waiting met her eyes. He lifted one shoulder slightly. "We have time," he said. Dinner at Ruth's was the kind of meal that frontier women made when they wanted to say something they didn't have language for. Every dish, a statement; every course, an argument for something that could not be spoken plainly. Ruth cooked as though she was making a case, and Clara ate with the specific appreciation of someone who understood what was being said and received it. Gideon ate 2 helpings of everything and told Ruth the biscuits were the best he'd had outside the mountain, which made Ruth stand 2 inches taller for the rest of the evening. After dinner, while Gideon was outside helping Ruth's hired hand with a stubborn gate latch that had been discussed at dinner, Ruth and Clara sat at the table with their coffee and the particular quiet of people who have reached the honest part of an evening. "Are you happy?" Ruth asked. Clara considered the question the way she considered everything, not quickly, not with the answer she thought was expected, but with the actual answer. "Yes," she said. "I am completely happy. Not the version of happiness where everything is easy. The version where everything is worth it." Ruth looked at her. "That's the real kind," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the 7 men. "Have you?" Clara said. "About the way this town talked about you," Ruth said. "About what I accepted as just the way things were. That a woman with a difficulty was a woman without a future." She looked down at her cup. "I had a thought last week that I can't shake loose. That if someone had seen you the way he saw you, even one person, years ago, you wouldn't have needed those 7 rejections to arrive at where you are. Clara was quiet for a moment. Maybe, she said. Or maybe I needed the 7 to understand what the 8th was actually worth. Ruth looked up. That's generous, she said. It's accurate, Clara said. I know exactly what I have because I know exactly what I lived without. Ruth nodded slowly. He loves you, I can see it. Yes, Clara said. He does, and you love him completely, Clara said. In the way that changes the shape of things. Ruth was quiet again. Then Red Hollow is going to tell this story for 20 years. You know that. I know, Clara said. They're going to say Gideon Blackwood swept you away from your troubles, Ruth said. That he rescued you. Clara looked at her friend. He didn't rescue me, she said. He recognized me. There's a difference. Yes, she said. I think that's exactly the difference. They rode back up the mountain the following morning. The trail was the best it had been since Clara first climbed it in October, the ice gone, the footing clear, the aspen showing the first faint green of their spring leaves in the groves along the lower section of the path. The mountain was different in May than it had been in any other season she had known it, and she had known it now in all of them. The frozen certainty of deep winter, the brutal clarifying cold of November, the slow grudging release of March. This was the season that said yes, the season that opened its hands. She rode beside Gideon and let the mountain be what it was around them, large, indifferent, demanding, honest. The kind of world that did not soften things for you but did not hide them either. The kind of world where what you were mattered than what you appeared to be, where the mountain would test you and the results would be exactly what they were. She had been tested. She knew what the results were. What are you thinking about? Gideon said. She had been thinking about Ruth, and Edmund Hale, and Harlan's nod from the trading post doorway, and Dorothea Price's 4 expressions in 2 seconds, and the surveyor boardroom, and Pruitt's field notes in their leather satchel, and Marsh's genuine handshake, and the letter from Aldous Marsh that had come before any of it saying, "This is winnable." She had been thinking about all of the things that had been decided about her before she had a chance to say otherwise, and all of the ways she had spent her life working against those decisions. And the strange particular gift of ending up somewhere that none of those decisions could follow her. About how far we are from Red Hollow, she said. He looked at her. 12 miles, he said. I know the distance, she said. I mean the other kind. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, feels like a different world. It is a different world, she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, her right hand, without looking at it, without any particular consciousness of what he was reaching for. Simply reaching for her hand because it was there and because it was hers, and he held it for a long moment while the horses walked and the mountain rose around them. Then he let go and they rode on. The cabin came into view around the last curve of the trail, as it always did, sudden, solid, real, sitting in the clearing the way a thing sits when it is exactly where it belongs. The smoke from the banked stove was still visible in a thin line from the chimney. The east fence line stood clean and correct. The creek on the east boundary ran loud and clear and undisputed. Clara looked at all of it. She looked at the cabin and the fence and the creek and the mountains above and the sky above the mountains. Specific deep Colorado blue that existed nowhere lower than this. And she thought about an October afternoon in Red Hollow, when a man had walked toward her across a street, and she had not yet known what it meant. She knew now. It meant this. Every specific detail of this, the legal filing and the winter storm and the dislocated shoulder and the 4 days snowed in and Pruitt's field notes and Marsh's careful arguments and the ruling arriving on the 28th day and Ruth crying on the main street and Edmund Hale coming down from the feed store step and saying I was wrong, and Gideon's hand over hers and the mountain, always the mountain, holding all of it in its cold and honest keeping. It meant a life that was actually hers. She had been waiting for that life without knowing how to describe it. She had known it was missing. She had stood in 7 different doorways of hope and been turned away, and each time she had gathered herself and kept going without being sure where going was taking her. It had taken her here. She dismounted in the yard of the cabin that was her home, on the mountain that was her home, beside the man who was her home, and she stood in the May morning, with both feet on solid ground, and felt the full, specific, undeniable weight of what it meant to be exactly where you were supposed to be. Gideon came around the horses and stood beside her. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the creek. He looked at her. "Home," he said. "Home," she said. 7 men had rejected Clara Whitman. They had looked at her hand and decided it told them everything they needed to know about her, and they had been wrong, and they had moved on to other women and other futures, and they would never fully understand what they had failed to see. But one man had ridden into Red Hollow, Colorado, on a gray horse on an October afternoon, and he had stood in a trading post and listened to a town explain why a woman was not worth choosing. And he had gone outside and watched that woman for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes he had seen what 30 years of Red Hollow had missed entirely. He had seen someone who did not need to be rescued. He had seen someone who needed to be recognized, and he had walked toward her. And she had said yes. And the mountain had held them both, through the winter and the storm and the legal battle and the long road back to a town that had underestimated her, and it had given them back to each other every morning, faithful as the creek, steady as the survey line, certain as the ground under their feet. Clara Whitman had been told she was not enough. She had built a life that proved otherwise, stone by stone, in the hardest terrain available, with the one person who had never needed to be convinced. That was the whole of the truth, and the truth, like the mountain, did not require anyone's permission to stand.